Nolan Hayes stood at the iron gates of the Blackwood estate with his 6-year-old son trembling against his chest, frost already forming on the child's eyelashes. The security guard's voice crackled through the intercom. "Move along, Ms. Blackwood doesn't take visitors." Nolan's fingers tightened around his son. 8 months ago, he'd had a house, a job, dignity. Now he had nothing but the desperate calculation that even a woman famous for her cruelty might hesitate before turning away a freezing child. He pressed the button again. "Please, just one night." Behind him, Chicago's winter night waited to finish what poverty had started. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The guard's sigh came through the speaker like static mixed with contempt. "Sir, I've already told you. I heard you." Nolan shifted his son's weight, feeling the boy's shallow breathing against his neck. "I'm not leaving." Through the camera mounted above the gate, someone was watching. Nolan could feel it the way you feel eyes on your back in a dark parking lot. He looked directly into the lens, past pride, past shame, into whatever calculus determined whether human beings deserve shelter when the temperature dropped below zero. The intercom went silent. Nolan counted his son's breaths. 12, 15, 20. His own injured hand throbbed where the assembly line had crushed 3 fingers 8 months ago. The workers' comp settlement barely covering a third of the surgery that hadn't quite worked. The tremor that had started after the accident pulsed through his fingers now, irregular as a damaged engine. "Daddy." His son's voice was small. "I'm cold." "I know, buddy, I know." The truth was simpler and more terrible than any lie. Nolan had run out of options 3 days ago. The shelter was full. The church basement was full. His brother had stopped answering calls after the 5th loan Nolan couldn't pay back. He'd spent the last of his cash on gas to drive here, to this estate in Lincoln Park, where rumors said a reclusive billionaire lived behind walls that might as well have been built on the moon. Desperation made people do insane things, like show up at a stranger's gate in the middle of winter and beg. The intercom crackled again. Different voice this time, female, precise. "State your business." Nolan cleared his throat. "My name is Nolan Hayes. I'm not asking for money, just shelter. One night. For my son." "How did you get this address?" "I used to work with a guy whose cousin did electrical work here 5 years ago." It sounded pathetic even as he said it. "I know this is crazy. I know you don't know me, but it's 8 degrees out here and dropping, and I've got nowhere else to go." Silence. Nolan pressed his face against his son's hair, smelling the cheap motel shampoo from 2 weeks ago, the last time they'd had a room. Since then, his car, a parked bathroom, the passenger seat with the engine running until the gas ran out. "My son is 6 years old," Nolan said, voice cracking. "Please." More silence. Then, "Stay where you are." The intercom went dead. Nolan stood there, his son's weight growing heavier, his injured hand going numb. Minutes passed. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't started falling yet, but would. He began to understand that he'd made a mistake, that he should leave before security came out and made him leave, that this was always going to be the answer. Then the gate buzzed and swung inward. Nolan stared. The driveway beyond curved through bare trees toward a mansion that looked like something from a period film, stone and iron and windows that glowed warm against the darkness. He took a step forward, then another, half expecting the gate to slam shut again, some kind of test he'd already failed. It didn't close. He walked through. The driveway was longer than it looked. By the time he reached the front entrance, his legs were shaking from more than cold. The massive door opened before he could knock, and a man in a dark suit stood there. Not a butler, Nolan thought, but something harder. Security, the kind who knew how to hurt people efficiently. "Inside," the man said, "quickly." The entrance hall hit Nolan like a memory of a life he'd never lived. Marble floors, a staircase that curved upward into shadow, paintings that were probably worth more than his parents' house. He stood there dripping melted frost onto stone that cost more per square foot than he'd made in a month. "Follow me." The security man walked toward a side room. "Ms. Blackwood will see you shortly." The room was smaller, a sitting area with leather furniture and a fireplace that was actually burning. Real wood. The heat felt obscene after weeks of cold. Nolan lowered his son onto a couch and started unwrapping the layers of inadequate clothing. The too small jacket, the hoodie with the broken zipper, the t-shirt that had been white once. "Daddy, where are we?" "Somewhere safe for tonight." His son's eyes were already heavy. Exhaustion was a kind of anesthetic. Nolan pulled off the kid's sneakers, soaked through, the soles wearing down to nothing, and tucked a throw blanket around him. Within minutes, the boy was asleep, his breathing finally evening out. Nolan sat on the edge of the couch and put his head in his hands. 8 months. That's how long it had taken to fall from stable to desperate. 8 months since the accident that had crushed his hand and his illusions about how the world worked. The injury itself was almost survivable. The real damage came from everything that followed. The company's lawyers fighting the workers' comp claim. The medical bills that insurance covered at 60%, leaving 40% of infinity. His wife's face when she finally said what they'd both been thinking, that she hadn't signed up for this version of their life. She'd left on a Tuesday, took the car that wasn't falling apart, her clothes, and the last of their savings from the account Nolan hadn't known she could access alone. The divorce papers came 2 weeks later. She didn't ask for custody. That should have hurt more than it did. The door opened. Nolan stood up fast, a reflex from the factory floor when supervisors walked by. The woman who entered wasn't what he expected. Vivian Blackwood was younger than the rumors suggested, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that looked at Nolan the way engineers looked at broken machines. Analytically, already calculating what was salvageable and what wasn't. "Mr. Hayes?" She didn't offer her hand. "You have 60 seconds to convince me this isn't a mistake." Nolan's mind went blank. He'd prepared for this moment during the drive over, rehearsed what he'd say, but standing in front of actual scrutiny made every prepared sentence feel like a lie. "I had a job," he started. "Factory work. I was good at it. Maintenance, repair, keeping the line running. 8 months ago I got hurt, bad enough that I couldn't work the same way." He held up his damaged hand, the one that still didn't close properly. "The company fought the claim. My wife left. I've been trying to find work, but nobody wants a mechanic who can't grip tools right. And your son, he's with me, always. I don't have anyone else who can—" The words stuck. "I take care of him." Vivian Blackwood's expression didn't change. "You drove here on what logic? That I would open my home to a stranger because you showed up with a child?" "No." Nolan met her eyes. "I drove here because I'm out of options, and it's 8 degrees outside, and I've spent the last 3 nights keeping my son alive in a car with no heat. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work. I'll do whatever you need, but tonight, I just need him to be warm." "You'll work." She said it like she was testing the weight of the words. "Doing what exactly with an injured hand and no references I can verify?" "I can still fix things. Not perfectly, maybe, but I can diagnose problems, figure out solutions. I spent 15 years keeping machines running that everyone else said were dead. I'm not useless yet." The security man who'd let them in cleared his throat from the doorway. "Ms. Blackwood, I can have them taken to a shelter. There's one in—" "The shelters are full," Nolan interrupted. "I've called. I've driven to everyone in a 30-mile radius. They're all full." Vivian studied him for a long moment. "How did you really get this address, Mr. Hayes?" "I told you. A guy I worked with. Nobody who worked here 5 years ago would remember a colleague's cousin well enough to give out this location. We're not in the phone book. Try again." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I looked through my old work buddy's phone one night when we were having beers, saw a text about a job at this address. I remembered it because he said the pay was insane and the owner was paranoid about privacy. When I ran out of everywhere else to go, I remembered." "So you violated your friend's privacy, memorized private information, and showed up at my gate with a compelling story?" "Yes." There was no point lying now. "I did. Because my son is 6 years old and I will do anything, any goddamn thing, to keep him alive. If that makes me a bad person, fine. I'll live with it." Something shifted in Vivian's face. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition, maybe. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds. "I don't do charity, Mr. Hayes. I don't rescue people. I built everything I have by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around me, and I didn't get there by making exceptions for sad stories." Nolan said nothing. There was nothing to say. However, Vivian turned back. "I do have a problem you might be able to solve. I have 2 industrial generators that have been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. I've had 4 different repair services look at them. None of them could fix the issue. If you can diagnose the problem by morning, I'll pay you $500 and let you stay in the guest house for 1 week. If you can't, you leave tomorrow and don't come back. $500? A week of shelter. Nolan's heart hammered against his ribs. Where are the generators? My head of security will take you to the equipment building. You'll work tonight, alone. There's a cot if you need to rest, but I expect a full diagnostic report by 7 a.m. And my son? He'll stay here. Warm, fed, safe. Vivian's eyes were cold. I'm not a monster, Mr. Hayes, but I am practical. You want shelter? You earn it. That's the deal. Nolan looked at his son still sleeping on the couch, face finally relaxed instead of pinched with cold and fear. Every instinct screamed not to leave him, but every instinct had failed him for 8 months straight. Okay, he said, I'll do it. The security man led him back outside, across the grounds to a large outbuilding that hummed with electrical equipment. Inside, the 2 generators sat like sleeping metal beasts, their control panels dark except for a few error lights blinking in sequence. You have until 7, the security man said. Don't try to leave the building. Don't try to access anything else. Just work. Then he left, and Nolan was alone with the machines. He approached the first generator, his damaged hand already aching from the cold walk over. The error lights blinked. 3 short, 2 long, pause, repeat. He pulled out his phone, battery at 6%, and tried to remember the manual codes from the factory. 3 short, 2 long usually meant fuel pressure inconsistency or air in the line. He found the maintenance panel and pried it open. His hand slipped on the first try, the tremor making his grip uncertain. He tried again, slower, using his good hand to steady the damaged one. The panel came free. Inside, everything looked wrong. Not broken exactly, but configured in a way that didn't match the error code. Someone had been in here recently. The connections were too clean, the wiring too neat. Professional work, which meant the professionals who'd looked at this had missed something obvious. Nolan pulled his phone's flashlight close and traced the fuel lines. Standard setup. Pressure valve in the right place. Filter clean. He followed the electrical connections next, checking each junction point, looking for the kind of mistake that only happened when someone was too confident in their expertise to double-check basic assumptions. There. A ground wire connected to the wrong terminal. Simple. Almost insultingly simple. The kind of mistake a first-year apprentice might make, but that someone with 15 years of experience would spot in 30 seconds. Nolan switched the connection, his injured hand shaking as he tightened the bolt. The error lights changed immediately. 3 short, pause. 3 short. Progress. He moved to the second generator, found the same mistake. Fixed it. Both generators hummed differently now, their rhythm smoothing out. He spent the next hour running diagnostics, checking and rechecking, making sure he hadn't missed anything. By the time he finished, his hand was screaming and his vision was starting to blur from exhaustion. But both generators were running clean, error lights off, power output stable. Nolan found the cot in the corner of the building, collapsed onto it, and was asleep before he could worry about whether he'd done enough. He woke to someone shaking his shoulder. The security man stood over him, face unreadable in the early light coming through the windows. It's 7. Ms. Blackwood wants your report. Nolan sat up, his body protesting every movement. The generators are fixed. Ground wires were connected to the wrong terminals on both units. I've got them running stable now. The security man's eyebrow lifted slightly. Show me. They walked to the control panel. Both generators were running smoothly, all lights green, power output exactly where it should be. The security man pulled out his phone, took pictures, sent them to someone. 2 minutes later, they were walking back to the main house. Vivian Blackwood was in what looked like a study, sitting behind a desk with 3 monitors showing security feeds, financial data, and something Nolan couldn't identify. She looked up as they entered. The generators are functional, the security man said. He fixed them. I can see that, Marcus. Vivian's eyes shifted to Nolan. Explain what the previous repair services missed. Nolan walked her through it, keeping his explanation simple and direct. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair. 4 different professionals looked at those generators. You found the problem in under 6 hours. The problem was simple. Sometimes simple is hard to see when you're looking for something complex. or when you're billing by the hour and have no incentive to actually solve the issue. Vivian opened a desk drawer, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across. $500. The guest house is yours for 1 week. After that, we'll see. Nolan picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of cash he hadn't held in months. Thank you. Don't thank me. You earned it. She turned back to her monitors. Marcus will show you the guest house. Your son is having breakfast in the kitchen. I suggest you eat something before you pass out. The guest house was small, just a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchenette, but it had heat and running water and a door that locked from the inside. Nolan stood in the middle of the room and felt something dangerous. Hope. His son was eating pancakes at a table in the main house's kitchen, talking to a woman in her 50s who was asking him about his favorite animals. The boy's face lit up when Nolan walked in. "Daddy, look, real food!" Nolan's throat closed up. He managed to nod, to sit down, to accept the plate the woman, the house manager, she introduced herself as Patricia, put in front of him. The food tasted like something from another lifetime. After breakfast, Marcus appeared again. "Ms. Blackwood wants to see you, alone." Nolan followed him back to the study. Vivian was still at her desk, but this time she was watching him instead of her screens. "The guest house arrangement is for 1 week," she said, "but I have a proposition. I need someone on site who can handle maintenance issues as they arise. The estate is large, the systems are complex, and I'm tired of calling outside services who either can't solve problems or take advantage of the situation. If you're interested, I'll pay you $3,000 a month, plus continued use of the guest house. You'll be on call, but the work is irregular. Some weeks, nothing. Other weeks, constant fires to put out. $3,000 a month. It wasn't what Nolan had made at the factory, but it was stable. It was enough. "What's the catch?" he asked. "The catch is that I will verify everything you've told me. Your employment history, your injury, your financial situation. If I find out you've lied about anything material, you're gone immediately. No second chances." "I haven't lied." "Then we have a deal." She stood and offered her hand. This time Nolan shook it, his damaged hand trembling slightly, but holding firm. "Welcome to the estate, Mr. Hayes. Try not to make me regret this." Over the next 3 days, Nolan worked through a backlog of small repairs, a malfunctioning security camera, a heating vent that wasn't distributing properly, a garage door sensor that had been misaligned. Each job was simple, the kind of thing he could do half asleep, but each completion felt like proof that he could still function, still contribute, still be something other than a burden. His son adjusted faster than Nolan expected. The guest house became home. Patricia, the house manager, started teaching the kid basic cooking. The estate's groundskeeper, an older man named Chen, showed him how to identify different types of trees. For the first time in 8 months, Nolan watched his son laugh without the shadow of fear behind it. But there was tension, too. Marcus, the head of security, watched Nolan constantly. Not hostile exactly, but evaluating, waiting for something. Nolan felt it every time they crossed paths, the weight of suspicion that couldn't be argued away, only endured. On the 4th night, Nolan woke at 2 a.m. to a text from Vivian. "Water leak in the main library. Come now." He dressed quickly, left his son sleeping, and jogged to the main house. The library was on the 2nd floor, and water was indeed leaking from somewhere in the ceiling, dripping onto antique furniture and shelves of books that probably cost more than Nolan's entire education. "The shutoff valve is behind the panel in the hallway," Vivian said, perfectly calm despite the minor disaster. "Turn it off, then find the source." Nolan found the valve, stopped the water, then climbed into the ceiling space above the library. The pipe had cracked at a junction point, old galvanized steel that should have been replaced years ago. He couldn't fix it permanently tonight, but he could patch it well enough to hold until morning. He worked in the cramped space, his injured hand making everything harder until the temporary seal held. When he climbed back down, Vivian was still there, watching. "That pipe should have been replaced," Nolan said. "The whole section is corroded. I can do it, but I'll need parts." "Make a list." "Marcus will get whatever you need." She looked at the ceiling, then at Nolan. "You could have told me you couldn't do this, that it was too difficult with your injury." "I didn't say I couldn't do it. I said it would take longer." Something that might have been approval crossed her face. "Get some sleep, Mr. Hayes. We'll handle the replacement tomorrow." But Nolan didn't go back to the guest house immediately. He was wired from the adrenaline of the repair. And the main house was quiet in a way that felt almost peaceful. He walked the hallway on the second floor, looking at paintings he didn't understand, trying to process the strangeness of his new situation. That's when he saw the light under a door at the end of the hall. He should have kept walking, should have gone back to the guest house and minded his own business. But he was curious, pathologically, stupidly curious about who Vivian Blackwood really was, about what kind of person built walls this high and still let desperate strangers inside. He moved closer to the door. Not to eavesdrop, he told himself, just to see if anyone needed help. Through the crack where the door hadn't quite closed, he could see into what looked like a private office. Vivian was there, talking to two men Nolan didn't recognize. Their voices were low, serious. Business, probably. None of his concern. He started to turn away. Then he heard his own name. "Hayes is a risk we don't need," one of the men was saying. "You've given him access to the entire estate after less than a week. What do you actually know about him?" "I know he's desperate and skilled." Vivian's voice was steady. "That's a useful combination. Desperate people are unpredictable. He could be gathering information, looking for leverage. For what purpose? He has no connections, no resources. He's not a threat." "You didn't think that about—" "Don't." Vivian's voice cut like a blade. That situation was completely different. Nolan's heart was hammering now. He should leave. He should run back to the guest house and pretend he'd heard nothing. Instead, he stood frozen, listening to people discuss whether he could be trusted, whether he was dangerous, whether letting him stay had been a mistake. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. Nolan spun around. Marcus stood there, face absolutely expressionless, phone already in his hand. "Step away from the door, Mr. Hayes." The office door opened. Vivian looked out, saw Nolan, saw Marcus. Her expression went cold in a way that made Nolan's stomach drop. "Inside," she said. "Now." Nolan walked into the office, his mind racing through explanations that all sounded like lies. The two men Vivian had been talking to watched him with the kind of professional assessment that suggested they were used to evaluating threats. "I wasn't," Nolan started. "You weren't eavesdropping on a private meeting at 2:30 in the morning?" Vivian's voice was arctic. "Then what exactly were you doing outside my office?" "I finished the repair and I was walking back. I saw the light. I thought maybe someone needed help. And instead of knocking, you stood outside the door and listened to a conversation that had nothing to do with you." There was no good answer. "Yes, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." One of the men cleared his throat. "Miss Blackwood, we should continue this discussion later." "No." Vivian's eyes never left Nolan. "We'll handle this now. Marcus, pull the security footage from the hallway. I want to see exactly how long Mr. Hayes was standing outside this door." Marcus left. The silence in the office felt like pressure building before an explosion. Nolan stood there, knowing he'd just destroyed the one chance he'd been given, the one piece of stability he'd managed to grab. 5 minutes later, Marcus returned with a tablet showing the security feed. Vivian watched it, her face unreadable. Nolan watched her watch it, seeing his own stupidity play out in grainy black and white, approaching the door, stopping, standing there for almost 2 full minutes before Marcus appeared. 2 minutes, Vivian said. "What exactly did you hear in those 2 minutes, Mr. Hayes?" Nolan could lie, should lie, but he was so tired of lying, of calculating, of trying to be anything other than what he was. "I heard one of these men say I was a risk, that I might be gathering information or looking for leverage. I heard you say I was desperate and skilled, which is true. Then someone mentioned a previous situation, and you cut them off." He met her eyes. "That's what I heard. And I'm sorry. I know I have no right to know your business or your history. I was out of line." The two men exchanged glances. Marcus stood by the door like a wall. Vivian was silent for a long moment. "Leave us," she said to the men. "Marcus, wait outside." When they were alone, Vivian gestured to a chair. "Sit." Nolan sat. His injured hand was shaking badly now, the tremor that always got worse under stress. "Do you know what I hate most about charity, Mr. Hayes?" Vivian didn't wait for an answer. "It creates debt. The person receiving help becomes obligated to the person giving it, and that obligation corrupts everything. I didn't let you stay here out of kindness. I let you stay because you demonstrated value. Do you understand the difference?" "I think so." "I don't think you do." Value means you contribute something I need. Charity means I give you something because I feel sorry for you. The first is a transaction. The second is poison. She leaned forward. What you just did, standing outside my office, listening to private conversations, that destroys value. It makes you a liability instead of an asset. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like someone who thinks desperation excuses poor judgment. It doesn't. Desperation explains your situation. It doesn't excuse violating the trust of the person who gave you an opportunity. Nolan's throat was tight. You're right. I can pack our things and leave in the morning. Is that what you think I want? For you to leave? I don't know what you want. Vivian stood and walked to the window. I want you to understand that second chances are rare, and third chances don't exist. I want you to know that I've built everything I have by being careful about who I trust and ruthless about cutting ties when that trust is broken. And I want you to tell me honestly whether you can be the kind of person who earns trust instead of exploiting it. Nolan took a breath. I can be. I want to be. But I'm also scared all the time that this is going to fall apart and I'll be back where I started. That fear makes me do stupid things, like standing outside your office trying to understand why you'd help someone like me. Someone like you? Vivian turned back. You mean someone poor, someone injured, someone desperate, someone who has nothing to offer except work that any healthy person could do better. That's your fear talking, not reality. You fixed generators that 4 professionals couldn't fix. You patched a pipe at 2 in the morning without complaining. You've done everything I've asked without making excuses about your injury. She crossed her arms. But none of that matters if you can't respect boundaries. This estate has rules. Privacy is one of them. Can you follow that rule or not? I can. Then go back to the guest house. Get some sleep. Tomorrow morning, you'll replace that corroded pipe, and we'll continue as if this conversation never happened. But understand, if something like this occurs again, you're done. No explanation, no second discussion, just gone. Am I clear? Yes. Nolan stood, started toward the door, then stopped. Can I ask one question? Vivian's expression suggested this was a bad idea, but she nodded. The man who said I was a risk. Was he wrong? About you specifically? I don't know yet. About desperate people in general? She paused. No. He wasn't wrong. Desperate people are unpredictable. They make mistakes. They take risks that more secure people wouldn't take. But they also work harder, value opportunities more, and sometimes, they become the most loyal people you'll ever meet, because they remember what it cost to get a second chance. Nolan nodded and left the office. Marcus was waiting in the hallway, face still expressionless. If you ever, Marcus said quietly, give me a reason to believe you're a threat to Miss Blackwood's safety or privacy, I will personally ensure you regret it. Am I understood? Yes. Good. Get some sleep, Mr. Hayes. Nolan walked back to the guest house through the dark grounds, his heart still racing. Inside, his son was still asleep, curled under blankets in a warm bed, safe for another night. Nolan sat on the edge of his own bed and looked at his damaged hand. The tremor had finally stopped. He'd nearly destroyed everything tonight, again, through weakness and curiosity and the desperate need to understand why someone like Vivian Blackwood would help someone like him. But he'd also been given something rare, clarity. This wasn't charity. This was a transaction. He had value as long as he could work, as long as he could be trusted, as long as he could prove he was worth the risk Vivian was taking. Tomorrow, he'd replace that corroded pipe. He'd do it well, efficiently, without complaint. And he'd start building something he hadn't had in 8 months, a reputation as someone who could be counted on. It wasn't mercy he needed, it was the chance to be reliable again. Nolan lay back on the bed and closed his eyes, exhaustion finally pulling him under. Tomorrow would be the first day of earning his place here, instead of just occupying it. He fell asleep planning pipe routes and valve replacements, his mind finally focused on something other than fear. Outside, the Chicago winter settled deeper into the night, but inside the guest house, Nolan Hayes and his son slept warm. The pipe replacement took 3 days instead of 1. The corrosion had spread further than Nolan initially diagnosed, threading through sections of the estate's plumbing system like rot through old wood. He worked methodically, cutting out damaged sections, installing new galvanized steel, testing each connection for leaks. His injured hand complained constantly, the tremor making precise work harder than it should have been, but he pushed through. Pain was just information. He'd learned that at the factory. On the second day, while Nolan was shoulder-deep in the ceiling space above the library, Marcus appeared below. Ms. Blackwood wants a status update. Nolan backed out of the crawl space, covered in dust and rust flakes. Another day, maybe two. The damage goes further than the initial assessment showed. She expected this finished yesterday. Then she expected wrong. Nolan wiped his face with his sleeve. I can rush it and have you dealing with another leak in 2 weeks, or I can do it right. Your choice. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe respect. Maybe just recognition that Nolan wasn't going to cut corners to meet an arbitrary deadline. Do it right, Marcus said, but keep me informed. By the third day, Nolan had replaced 40 feet of pipe, rerouted 2 problem sections, and upgraded 3 junction points that were waiting to fail. When he finally sealed the last connection and turned the water back on, nothing leaked. He stood in the library watching the ceiling for 10 minutes, waiting for the telltale drip that would mean he'd missed something. Nothing came. Patricia found him there, still staring up. Nolan? You okay? Yeah, just making sure. The ceiling's not going to collapse if you stop looking at it. She smiled. Come on, your boy's been asking for you all morning. Nolan found his son in the kitchen, sitting at the counter with Chen, the groundskeeper, both of them sketching something on a large piece of paper. His kid looked up, face bright. Dad, Chen's teaching me how to draw trees. Look. The drawing was crude but enthusiastic. A tree with branches that looked more like lightning bolts than actual limbs. Nolan felt something catch in his chest. When was the last time his son had drawn anything? When was the last time there'd been paper and pencils available? When survival wasn't the only thing on the schedule? That's great, buddy. Really good. Chen nodded approvingly. He has good observation skills, notices details most people miss. After lunch, Nolan reported to Vivian's study. She was on a phone call when he arrived, speaking in what sounded like Mandarin, her voice sharp and decisive. She gestured for him to sit and continued the conversation for another 3 minutes before ending the call. The pipes are finished? She asked without preamble. Finished and tested. No leaks. I also flagged 3 other sections that'll need attention in the next 6 months before they become problems. Vivian pulled up something on her computer, scanned it. The original estimate from the plumbing company was $12,000 and a 2-week timeline. They were going to replace everything, not just the damaged sections. Easier for them, more expensive for you. And your approach cost? Parts were about $1,800. Labor's already covered in my monthly pay. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. You realize you could have told me the full system needed replacement. I would have authorized it. You could have made this a bigger project, guaranteed yourself more job security. Job security based on making up problems I don't actually need to solve? Nolan shook his head. That's not security. That's fraud with extra steps. Most contractors don't see it that way. I'm not a contractor. I'm a mechanic who fixes things because they're broken, not because I can bill for it. Vivian made a note on her computer. There's a car in the garage that won't start. Mercedes S-Class, about 8 years old. Marcus has been trying to get the dealership to send someone for 2 weeks. Take a look at it when you have time. I'm better with industrial equipment than luxury cars, but I'll see what I can do. If you can't figure it out, say so. I'd rather hear, I don't know, than have you waste time pretending you can solve everything. Nolan stood to leave, then hesitated. Can I ask something? Vivian's expression suggested this was becoming a habit she didn't appreciate, but she nodded. That night outside your office, you said desperate people sometimes become the most loyal people you'll ever meet. Was that? He paused, trying to find the right words. Was that about someone specific? Her face went carefully blank. That's not your business, Mr. Hayes. Right. Sorry. He was almost to the door when she spoke again. Yes, it was about someone specific, someone who proved that theory correct. And no, I'm not going to tell you the story, so don't ask. Nolan nodded and left. The Mercedes was in the garage, sleek and black and utterly foreign to everything Nolan knew about engines. He popped the hood and stared at the engine compartment, recognizing maybe 60% of what he was looking at. The rest was computerized systems and German engineering that might as well have been alien technology. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Not even a click. Dead battery maybe, except the dashboard lights came on fine when he turned the key to auxiliary. He checked the connections, the alternator, the starter. Everything looked fine, which meant the problem was probably electronic, buried somewhere in the car's diagnostic system. Nolan pulled out his phone and started searching for common issues with this model year. 3 hours later, he'd watched 7 YouTube videos, read 4 forum threads, and had a headache from squinting at schematics. But he'd also found the likely culprit, a known issue with the ignition control module, which could fail without throwing a proper error code. The module was buried under 3 other components. Getting to it required removing parts in a specific sequence, like a mechanical puzzle designed by someone who hated mechanics. Nolan worked carefully, his injured hand making everything twice as difficult. A bolt slipped from his trembling fingers and pinged away into the darkness under the car. He swore, crawled under to retrieve it, hit his head on the undercarriage. "Problem?" Marcus's voice came from the garage entrance. Nolan slid out from under the car, rubbing his head. "Just slow going. I'm not used to working on cars that cost more than houses." "Can you fix it or not?" "Ask me in 4 hours." Marcus watched him for a moment. "You know, most people in your situation would have said yes immediately, promised they could fix anything just to keep the job." "Most people in my situation would be right. I'm the idiot who's honest about his limitations." Something that might have been amusement crossed Marcus's face. Ms. Blackwood values honesty, even when it's inconvenient. Does she value results? Even more. Marcus left. Nolan went back to work, removing components with surgical care, until he finally had the ignition control module in his hands. The connections were corroded, subtle but definitive. He cleaned them with electrical contact cleaner, checked for physical damage, found none. Reassembled everything in reverse order, double-checking each step. When he turned the key, the engine started immediately, purring like it had never been sick. Nolan sat in the driver's seat, feeling the vibration of a working engine, and allowed himself 30 seconds of satisfaction before getting back to work, documenting what he'd done and what parts would need to be ordered for a permanent fix. That night, after his son was asleep, Nolan sat at the small table in the guest house and looked at the envelope Vivian had given him 2 weeks ago. $500, which he still hadn't touched except to hide it in the back of a drawer. It felt like emergency money, the kind you didn't spend unless everything else failed. He'd been living off the $3,000 monthly payment, which had already started to dig him out of the immediate crisis. The medical bills were still there, though, $17,000 in collections, growing with interest and fees every month. His credit was destroyed. The car he'd been living in before coming here had finally died completely, towed from where he'd abandoned it. He had nothing except what was in this room and the goodwill of a woman who'd made it clear that goodwill was transactional. His phone buzzed, text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Patricia. Vivian wants to see you tomorrow at 9 a.m., main house study. She said to tell you it's not bad news." Nolan read the message 3 times, trying to decode what not bad news meant. In his experience, people only said that when the news was actually bad, but they wanted you to stop panicking long enough to hear it. He texted back, "I'll be there." Sleep came hard that night. He kept running through scenarios, trying to figure out what he might have done wrong, what complaint might have been filed, what rule he'd broken without realizing. By the time morning came, he'd convinced himself he was about to be fired in the kindest way possible. At 9, he knocked on the study door. "Come in." Vivian was at her desk, as always, but this time there was a woman sitting across from her. Professional-looking, early 50s, carrying a leather briefcase that screamed lawyer or accountant. "Mr. Hayes, this is Susan Reeves. She's a financial attorney who does work for me occasionally. I asked her to look into your situation." Nolan's stomach dropped. "My situation?" Susan opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Your medical debt. Ms. Blackwood provided me with the details you gave her and asked me to investigate the legitimacy of the claims. I've spent the last week reviewing your case." "I don't understand. The hospital that treated you after your injury," Susan continued, "billed your insurance company for several procedures you never received. Your insurance paid their portion, but you were left with the balance on fraudulent charges. I've documented 8 separate billionaires, totaling just over $11,000. Nolan sat down without being invited. "Fraudulent charges?" Medical billing fraud is unfortunately common. Hospitals bill for the maximum possible, insurance companies fight it, and patients get caught in the middle. Susan slid a document across the desk. I filed disputes on all 8 charges. Based on similar cases, I estimate you'll see your total debt reduced to around $6,000 within 90 days. 6,000 instead of 17. Correct. Additionally, 3 of the charges are old enough that they're approaching the statute of limitations for collections. If you can avoid payment agreements on those specific debts for another 14 months, they'll become legally uncollectible. Nolan looked at Vivian. Why are you doing this? Because debt makes people desperate, and desperate people make poor decisions. I'd rather you focus on your work than spend your nights worrying about collectors. She gestured to Susan. She'll handle the disputes. You just need to sign authorization forms allowing her to represent you with the hospital and collection agencies. Susan pushed the forms across the desk. I'll need your signature here, here, and here. Nolan's hand shook as he signed. Not from the injury this time, but from something else. Relief, maybe? Or fear that this was too good to be real, that there was a catch he wasn't seeing. When the forms were signed, Susan packed up her briefcase. I'll be in touch as things progress. The hospital will likely push back initially, but the documentation is solid. We'll win this. After she left, Nolan stayed in his chair trying to process what had just happened. You look confused, Vivian observed. I'm trying to figure out what you want from me. What I want is for you to stop acting like you're waiting for me to kick you out. The debt was a problem. I had it investigated. It turned out to be partially fraudulent. Now it's being resolved. That's all this is. Nobody does that. Nobody helps with someone else's debt just because. I'm not nobody, Mr. Hayes. I'm someone who understands that talent is wasted when it's buried under problems that can be solved with the right resources. She turned back to her computer. Your son starts school on Monday. Patricia has enrolled him at the academy in Lake Forest. Transportation will be provided. Nolan's voice came out rougher than he intended. I can't afford private school tuition. It's covered, part of your employment package. That wasn't in the original deal. The original deal was for 1 week. We're past that now. Vivian looked up. Unless you'd prefer to send him to the public school in your old district, I can arrange that instead. No, Nolan stopped, trying to organize thoughts that kept scattering. Thank you. I don't know how else to say it. Then don't. Just make sure he gets to the transport van on time. Patricia will give you the schedule. Nolan left the study and walked through the main house in a daze. In the hallway, he ran into Chen, who was carrying pruning shears and a bucket. You look like you've seen a ghost, Chen said. I think I'm being rescued and I don't know how to handle it. Chen smiled. Ms. Blackwood doesn't rescue people. She invests in them. Big difference. What's the difference? Rescue implies you're helpless. Investment implies you're valuable. She sees value in you, so she's removing obstacles that prevent you from delivering on that value. Smart business. Feels like more than business. Maybe, but she won't thank you for saying so. Chen shifted the bucket to his other hand. Your boy asked me this morning if you were going to stay here forever. What did you tell him? I haven't told him anything yet. I don't know what to tell him. Tell him the truth. That you're working hard and doing your best. Kids can handle truth better than adults think. That night, Nolan sat with his son and tried to explain their new situation without making promises he couldn't guarantee. You're going to start school on Monday, a real school with teachers and other kids. His son's eyes went wide. A school? Not like before? Not like before meant the 3 months they'd tried to make public school work while living in the car. Showing up late or not at all. His kid falling asleep in class because he'd been up all night trying to stay warm. The teachers had been sympathetic but ultimately unable to help. Child services had gotten involved. Nolan had pulled his son out before the situation could get worse. A school, Nolan confirmed. You'll ride in a van with other kids. They'll pick you up in the morning and bring you back in the afternoon. Will you be here when I get back? The question cut deeper than his son probably meant it to. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Nolan wanted to promise. Wanted to say the words that would make his kid feel safe. But he'd learned that promises without the power to keep them were just lies with better packaging. I promise I'll do everything I can to stay here, to keep us safe, okay? His son nodded, apparently satisfied with qualified honesty. They spent the rest of the evening playing cards with a deck Patricia had given them, and for a few hours, life felt almost normal, like they were just a regular father and son, doing regular things, instead of two people trying to rebuild from rubble. On Monday morning, Nolan watched the van pull away with his son inside, waving from a window. Then he went back to work, trying to ignore the fear that this was all temporary, that he'd wake up tomorrow back in the car with nothing but cold and hunger and the endless calculation of how to survive another day. The estate's heating system developed a problem on Tuesday. One of the boilers was cycling incorrectly, wasting fuel and failing to maintain consistent temperature. Nolan spent 6 hours tracing the issue through a maze of pipes and controls until he found the faulty sensor. He replaced it, recalibrated the system, and had everything running smoothly by evening. On Wednesday, Marcus asked him to look at the security cameras along the north wall. 3 of them had intermittent connection issues. Nolan found corroded wiring in the junction box and spent the afternoon replacing connections and waterproofing the housing so the problem wouldn't recur. On Thursday, Vivian called him to her study again. "Marcus tells me you've been logging 12-hour days. There's a lot to do." "There's always a lot to do. That doesn't mean you need to do all of it in 1 week." She pulled up a document on her screen. "I'm instituting a formal schedule, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Anything beyond that requires my explicit approval. I don't mind the extra work. I mind the liability if you injure yourself because you're exhausted, and I mind the example it sets for my son." Nolan blinked. "Your son? He's 10. He lives in the East Wing with his nanny. You've probably heard him but haven't met him yet. I keep his existence private for security reasons." Vivian's expression softened slightly. "He's been asking Patricia about your son. Apparently they're both interested in the same video game." "I didn't know you had a kid." "Most people don't. I prefer it that way." She closed the document. "The point is, he watches how the adults around him work. I don't want him thinking it's normal to grind yourself into exhaustion for a paycheck. 8 hours, 5 days. Clear?" "Clear." "Good. Now go pick up your son from school. Patricia says the van drops him off at 3:30. Nolan made it to the front gate just as the van pulled up. His son climbed out, talking excitedly to another kid, and ran over with a backpack that looked comically large on his small frame. "Dad, we learned about fractions today. And I made a friend. His name is Marcus. Not the security Marcus, a different Marcus. And he likes dinosaurs too." The words tumbled out in a rush that made Nolan's chest ache with something close to joy. This was what childhood was supposed to look like. Excitement about school, friends, fractions. "That's great, buddy. Tell me all about it." They walked back to the guest house together, his son narrating every detail of his day with the kind of enthusiasm that came from actually having good things to talk about. For the first time in 8 months, Nolan allowed himself to believe that maybe they'd landed somewhere stable. Maybe this could last. That belief lasted until Friday morning. When Marcus knocked on the guest house door at 6 a.m., Nolan answered in his boxers, half asleep. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But we need to talk. Get dressed and meet me by the garage." 10 minutes later, Nolan stood in the cold morning air, watching Marcus pace like he was working through a problem that didn't have a good solution. "I've been watching you," Marcus said finally. "For 2 weeks. Every move, every interaction, every decision. You know why? Because it's your job to protect Ms. Blackwood." "Exactly. And my job is telling me something that I don't particularly like." Nolan's stomach tightened. "Which is?" "That you're exactly what you appear to be. A skilled mechanic who's grateful for the opportunity and isn't angling for anything beyond honest work." Marcus stopped pacing. "That should make me feel better." "It doesn't." "Why not?" "Because in my experience, people don't end up at Vivian Blackwood's gate by accident. They show up because they want something: money, access, leverage. You showed up with a compelling story and a sympathetic prop. My son isn't a prop. I know that now. But 2 weeks ago I didn't. And I still don't fully understand why Vivian let you stay." Marcus crossed his arms. "She doesn't do charity. She doesn't rescue people. But she did both for you, and that makes me nervous. So what do you want from me?" "I want you to understand that if you hurt her, financially, emotionally, or any other way, I will end you. Not physically. I don't need violence. I'll destroy every inch of stability you've built. Your job, your housing, your son's school enrollment. All of it gone. Marcus's voice was calm, matter of fact. Do we understand each other? Nolan met his eyes. Yeah, we do. Good. Marcus turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I think you're probably genuine. But I get paid to think the worst of people until they prove otherwise. You're still in the proving stage. After Marcus left, Nolan stood in the cold for a while, trying to decide if he'd just been threatened or warned. Maybe both. Maybe they were the same thing. He spent the day working on the estate's irrigation system, which was preparing for winter shutdown. The work was mechanical, requiring attention, but not creativity, which left his mind free to wander through the conversation with Marcus. The message was clear. He was being watched, evaluated, measured against some standard he didn't fully understand. That night, while his son did homework at the kitchen table, Nolan's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Yeah? Nolan Hayes? A woman's voice, professional and clipped. Who's asking? My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm a reporter with the Chicago Tribune. I'm working on a story about Vivian Blackwood's household staff, and I'd like to ask you some questions. Every alarm in Nolan's head started screaming. How did you get this number? Public records. Your name appeared in connection with an address in Lake Forest. Papers rustled on her end. I'm particularly interested in how you came to work for Ms. Blackwood. The timeline is unusual. You went from unemployment and medical debt to private estate employment in less than 2 weeks. I don't talk to reporters. Mr. Hayes, I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm just looking for context on... Nolan hung up. His hands were shaking. He sat down hard on the couch, trying to think through the implications. A reporter asking questions about him, about Vivian, about how he'd gotten hired. That couldn't be coincidence. Someone had pointed the reporter in his direction. He texted Marcus. Just got a call from a Tribune reporter asking about my employment here. Thought you should know. The response came in under 30 seconds. Don't answer any more calls. I'm handling it. Nolan put the phone down and looked at his son, who was focused on his math homework, completely oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. This was the problem with stability. It made you visible, and visibility brought scrutiny. 20 minutes later, Marcus appeared at the door. Tell me exactly what she asked. Nolan recounted the conversation word for word. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. This is the third time this month someone's tried to dig into Ms. Blackwood's private life, Marcus said. First two were photographers trying to get pictures of her son. Now it's a reporter trying to build a story about household staff. Someone's feeding information to the press. You think it's me? No. You wouldn't have told me about the call if you were the source. But someone in this household is talking, and I need to find out who. Marcus pulled out his phone and typed something. For now, don't answer any calls from numbers you don't recognize. If a reporter approaches you in person, don't engage. Just walk away and contact me immediately. This is going to come back on me, isn't it? The fact that I showed up out of nowhere, that Vivian hired me without a formal vetting process. The vetting process was plenty formal, Marcus interrupted. I ran a complete background check the first night you were here. I know about your work history, your injury, your ex-wife, your debts, and the 3 speeding tickets you got in 2019. You're clean, desperate, but clean. Then what's the problem? The problem is that reporters don't care about the truth. They care about the story. And Reclusive Billionaire takes in homeless father and child is a much better story than employer hires qualified maintenance worker. One makes her look soft, vulnerable. And vulnerability attracts the kind of attention she's spent years avoiding. Marcus left. Nolan sat with his son until bedtime, then stayed up late trying to figure out how he'd become a liability when all he'd done was work hard and stay quiet. The answer came Saturday morning when Patricia knocked on the guest house door with a grim expression. Vivian wants to see you, now. The walk to the main house felt like a march to execution. Nolan's mind raced through possibilities, most of them ending with him packing his things and trying to explain to his son why they had to leave. Vivian's study door was open. She sat at her desk, staring at a laptop screen with an expression that could have frozen water. Shut the door and sit down. Nolan obeyed. On the screen he could see a news article with a headline, Blackwood's mystery employee from bankruptcy to billionaire's estate in days. I didn't talk to them, Nolan said immediately. I know, the article's based entirely on public records and speculation, but that doesn't make it less damaging. Vivian turned the screen toward him. Read it. The article was exactly what Marcus had predicted. A breathless narrative about how Nolan had gone from desperate poverty to working for one of Chicago's most reclusive billionaires, complete with implications that there was more to the story than simple employment. It quoted anonymous sources suggesting everything from charity case to potential fraud. His son was mentioned by first name only, described as a tool for gaining sympathy and access. Nolan's vision went red around the edges. They're calling my kid a tool. They're doing their job, which is manufacturing controversy where none exists. Vivian closed the laptop. The question is how we respond. Marcus wants to threaten legal action. My PR team wants to release a statement. I'm considering doing absolutely nothing and letting it blow over. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep working and ignore it. Don't read the article again. Don't search for others. Don't respond if reporters contact you. Just continue doing exactly what you've been doing. And if it doesn't blow over, if this keeps getting bigger, Vivian leaned back in her chair. Then I'll handle it. That's not your responsibility. It's about me. How is it not my responsibility? Because you didn't create this situation. You showed up desperate and honest. I made a business decision to employ you, and now parasites are trying to build a story out of nothing. None of that is your fault. Her voice softened slightly. Unless you think it would be better if you left. If that's easier, no. The word came out harder than Nolan intended. I'm not leaving, not unless you fire me. Then we're settled. Go back to work. And Nolan? She waited until he met her eyes. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Reporters are like sharks. They smell blood and they circle. But they also get bored quickly when there's no actual story to sustain them. This will pass. Nolan wanted to believe her. He left the study and went back to the guest house where his son was watching cartoons, completely unaware that strangers were writing about him in newspapers. The next week was quieter. The article didn't gain traction beyond local news cycles. No other reporters called. Life on the estate returned to its routine. Work during the day, dinner with his son, sleep in an actual bed instead of a car seat. But something had shifted. Marcus watched him differently now, not with suspicion exactly, but with a kind of acknowledgement. Patricia started leaving extra food from the main house kitchen, claiming she'd made too much and it would go to waste otherwise. Chen invited his son to help with planting bulbs for spring, teaching him the Latin names of flowers. And Vivian, in her own carefully distant way, had shown him something important, that she was willing to take heat for keeping him employed. That his presence here wasn't just transactional convenience, but a decision she was prepared to defend. On Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the article, Nolan was replacing a section of fencing near the north wall when he heard voices from the other side. Kids' voices. Laughing. He climbed the ladder and looked over. In the neighboring yard, which belonged to an estate almost as large as Vivian's, 2 boys were playing soccer, kicking the ball back and forth with the kind of casual skill that came from expensive coaching. One of them looked up and saw Nolan. Hey, is that the Blackwood place? Yeah. My mom says a homeless guy works there now. Is that true? The other boy laughed. Dude, that's rude. I'm just asking. Nolan climbed down from the ladder and went back to work. The conversation floated over the wall, the boys moving on to other topics, but the words stuck with him. That's what he was now, in the neighborhood gossip. The homeless guy who worked for Vivian Blackwood. Not a mechanic, not an employee. The homeless guy. That night, he looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and tried to see what others saw. His face was less gaunt than it had been 2 weeks ago. Regular meals had started to fill him out again. His hands were dirty from work, the injured one still tremoring slightly but functional. He looked like what he was, a man who'd fallen hard and was clawing his way back up. The question was whether he'd ever be seen as anything else. His son appeared in the doorway, already in his pajamas. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. Are we poor? Nolan turned off the water, dried his hands. Why are you asking? A kid at school said we must be poor because we live in a guest house instead of a real house. I said we have a real house, but he said guest houses don't count. Nolan knelt down so they were eye level. We're working on not being poor, does that make sense? His son nodded slowly. Like when I'm working on getting better at reading? Exactly like that, we're making progress. It just takes time. Okay. His son hugged him quickly, then ran off to brush his teeth. Nolan stayed kneeling on the bathroom floor, feeling the weight of everything his kid didn't say, the questions he didn't ask, the fears he was learning to carry quietly because he'd watched his father carry them the same way. They were working on not being poor. It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that they were one bad decision, one lost job, one expensive emergency away from being right back where they'd started. And no amount of work could guarantee that wouldn't happen. But work was all Nolan had. So he stood up, finished getting ready for bed, and planned out the next day's projects. The estate's main gate mechanism was sticking. The greenhouse heating system needed a pre-winter inspection. There were always things that needed fixing. And as long as there were things to fix, there was a reason to stay. The gate mechanism failed completely on a Tuesday morning in early November. Nolan was replacing light fixtures in the main house when Marcus found him, moving fast enough that Nolan knew something was actually wrong. Gate stuck closed. Vivian has a meeting downtown in 40 minutes, and the backup system isn't responding either. They jogged to the entrance together. The massive iron gate sat frozen halfway open, its motor making a grinding sound that suggested something had stripped or jammed. Nolan pulled the access panel and immediately saw the problem. A gear assembly had cracked under stress, probably from years of use without proper maintenance. "Can you fix it?" Marcus asked. "Not in 40 minutes. This needs a replacement part I don't have." "So what do we do?" Nolan looked at the gate, then at the manual override mechanism. "We do it the old-fashioned way. Help me disengage the motor." Together, they disconnected the automated system and switched to manual mode. The gate was heavy as hell, designed to stop vehicles, not to be moved by hand. But with both of them pulling, it swung open far enough for a car to pass through. Vivian's Mercedes pulled up 3 minutes later. She lowered the window and looked at Nolan, who was sweating despite the cold. "How long until it's fixed properly?" "I need to order a part. 2 days? Maybe 3. Make it 2. And Marcus, arrange for temporary security at the gate until the automation is restored." She drove through without waiting for confirmation. After she left, Marcus and Nolan manually closed the gate again, then stood there catching their breath. "You ever notice she doesn't say thank you?" Nolan asked. "She does. Just not with words." Marcus wiped his forehead. "The fact that she didn't fire you for not fixing it in 40 minutes? That's her version of gratitude." Nolan ordered the part that afternoon, paying extra for expedited shipping. It arrived Thursday morning, and he spent 6 hours installing it, recalibrating the sensors, and testing every function until the gate operated as smoothly as it probably had when it was first installed. When he finished, his injured hand was barely functional, the tremor so bad he had to sit on the ground and wait for it to calm down. Patricia found him there, sitting against the fence with his hand cradled against his chest. "You okay?" "Yeah, just pushed too hard." She sat down next to him, which seemed wrong. She was in her 50s and well-dressed and definitely not the type to sit in the dirt, but she did it anyway. "You know what Vivian told me this morning?" Patricia said. "She said you were the first person in 3 years who'd fixed something on this estate without making it someone else's problem first. That's a low bar." "You'd think, but most of the contractors we hire, they're looking for ways to expand the job, bring in specialists, turn a 2-hour fix into a 2-week project. You just solve the problem and move on." "Because I need this job. Because I can't afford to play games." Patricia smiled. "You think that's why? But I've watched a lot of desperate people work here over the years. Desperation makes most of them sloppy, not careful. You're different." "Different how?" "You still have pride in the work, even when nobody's watching." She stood up, brushed dirt off her pants. "That's rare. Don't lose it." That night, Nolan's son came home from school quieter than usual. He did his homework without being asked, ate dinner without talking, and went to bed early. Nolan knew something was wrong, but also knew that pushing wouldn't help. His kid would talk when he was ready. The truth came out Friday morning at breakfast. "Dad, do you think we're going to stay here forever?" Nolan set down his coffee. "What brought this up?" "Some kids at school were talking about how their families have lived in the same house for like generations. And I was thinking about how we've lived in 3 different places just this year." 4 places, actually, but Nolan didn't correct him. "We're staying here as long as I have this job. And I'm going to work as hard as I can to keep this job. But what if something happens? What if you get hurt again, or Ms. Blackwood decides she doesn't need you anymore?" The fear in his son's voice was an echo of Nolan's own anxiety, the constant background calculation of how fragile their stability really was. He wanted to promise that everything would be fine, that they'd never have to leave, that the worst was behind them. But he'd learned that false promises hurt worse than honest uncertainty. If something happens, we'll figure it out. Together. Like we always do. Nolan reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. But right now, today, we're safe. We have a home, you have school, I have work. That's enough for today. His son nodded, apparently satisfied, and finished his cereal. But the conversation stuck with Nolan all morning as he worked on weatherproofing the equipment shed. His kid was right to be scared. They were one mistake away from losing everything again. And mistakes were easy to make when you were tired, when your hand wouldn't stop shaking, when the weight of keeping a 6-year-old safe made every decision feel like it carried impossible stakes. Around noon, Marcus appeared with a phone in his hand and an expression Nolan couldn't read. "Vivian wants to see you. Now. And she said to bring anything you don't want left in the guest house unsupervised." The bottom dropped out of Nolan's stomach. What does that mean? It means bring your important stuff. I'll wait. Nolan's mind raced through what he might have done wrong as he walked to the guest house. He grabbed his son's birth certificate, the folder with his employment paperwork, the envelope with the $500 he still hadn't spent. Everything else was replaceable. His hands were shaking worse than usual as he walked back to Marcus. They didn't go to the study. Instead, Marcus led him to a part of the main house Nolan had never been to, the east wing where Vivian's son lived. The hallway was quieter here, decorated with framed children's artwork and photos that Vivian kept carefully hidden from the outside world. Marcus knocked on a door. A woman's voice called out, "Come in!" Inside was a bedroom bigger than the entire guest house, and in the middle of it stood Vivian with a boy who looked like a younger, male version of her. Same dark hair, same analytical eyes. The kid was holding a tablet and looking annoyed. "Mr. Hayes," Vivian said, "this is my son, Daniel. Daniel, this is Nolan Hayes, our maintenance supervisor." Daniel looked up from his tablet. "The guy who fixed the generators? That's him." "Cool." Daniel went back to his tablet. Nolan stood there, completely confused about why he'd been summoned to meet a 10-year-old. Vivian gestured to the woman who'd let them in. The nanny, presumably. "Daniel's been asking to meet your son. I'm told they have similar interests. I thought perhaps we could arrange a play date." The word playdate coming from Vivian Blackwood's mouth was so surreal that Nolan almost laughed. "A playdate? Is that a problem?" "No, it's just, I wasn't expecting. My son has very few opportunities to interact with other children outside of supervised school environments. Your son lives on the estate and has been vetted by my security team. It's a practical solution to a logistical problem." Daniel looked up again. "Mom, you're making it weird. Just ask if his kid wants to play video games tomorrow." Vivian's expression suggested this was not how she'd planned the conversation going. "Yes, that. Video games. Tomorrow afternoon, if you're amenable." Nolan found himself nodding. "Yeah, sure, my son would love that." "Good. Marcus will coordinate the details." Vivian turned to leave, then paused. "And Mr. Hayes? The reason I asked you to bring your important documents is because I'm moving you to different accommodations. The guest house needs renovation work, and it's more efficient if you're not living in it during construction." "Where am I moving to?" "The apartment above the garage. It's larger, has 2 bedrooms, and includes a proper kitchen. Patricia will help with the transition this weekend." She left before Nolan could respond. Marcus gestured for him to follow, and they walked back through the house in silence until they reached the garage. The apartment above it was accessed by an external staircase. Marcus unlocked the door and led Nolan inside. The space was easily twice the size of the guest house. A real living room, a kitchen with actual counter space, 2 bedrooms with doors that closed, and a bathroom with a shower instead of just a cramped stall. "This is—" Nolan stopped, trying to find words that didn't sound pathetically grateful. "It's been vacant for 2 years, Marcus said. Vivian used to have a live-in driver who stayed here before she decided she preferred driving herself. It needs some updates, but it's functional." Nolan walked through the rooms, his mind struggling to process that this was real, that he was being given more instead of less. One of the bedrooms had a window overlooking the estate grounds. The other had built-in bookshelves and enough space for his son to actually play instead of just exist in cramped quarters. "Why is she doing this?" Nolan asked. Marcus leaned against the doorframe. Because Daniel asked. He told her it wasn't fair that he had a huge room and your kid was living in a space smaller than Daniel's closet. And when Daniel asked Vivian for something reasonable, she has a hard time saying no. She could have just said no. She could have, but she didn't. Marcus pulled out his phone and checked something. Move your stuff this weekend. Let me know if you need help with anything heavy. After Marcus left, Nolan stood in the empty apartment and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. The dangerous possibility of hope. Not just that things were okay right now, but that they might actually keep getting better. That maybe, just maybe, they'd found a place where they could stop running. The move happened Saturday morning. Nolan didn't have much. Their belongings fit in 6 boxes and 2 garbage bags. Patricia showed up with extra towels, kitchen supplies, and a can opener that actually worked. Chen brought a small potted plant for the kitchen windowsill. Even Marcus helped carry boxes up the stairs, though he didn't say much while doing it. By afternoon, they were settled. His son claimed the room with the bookshelves and immediately started arranging his few toys on the empty shelves like he was curating a museum. Nolan stood in the doorway watching, remembering all the places they'd lived in the past year. The car, the motel rooms, the shelters, the guest house. Each one a temporary stop, a place to survive but not to live. This felt different. This felt like they might actually get to stay. Sunday afternoon, Daniel came over for the promised play date. He showed up with his nanny, a backpack full of video game controllers, and an air of casual confidence that came from never having to worry about whether he'd have a home tomorrow. Your apartment is cool, Daniel said, looking around. Better than the guest house. Yeah, Nolan's son agreed. It's way bigger. They disappeared into the bedroom to play games, and Nolan found himself making awkward small talk with Daniel's nanny, a woman named Lisa, who'd apparently been with the family for 6 years. Daniel doesn't usually ask to visit other kids' houses, Lisa said, accepting the coffee Nolan offered. His mother is very particular about his social circle. Because of privacy and safety. When your mother is worth several $billion, everyone's a potential threat, or wants something. Lisa sipped her coffee. But he really wanted to meet your son. He's been talking about him for weeks. From the bedroom came the sound of laughter and friendly arguing about game strategies. Normal kid sounds, the kind of sounds Nolan's son hadn't made in months. 2 hours later, when Lisa said it was time to go, both boys complained. Can we do this again next week? Daniel asked. Lisa looked at Nolan. If it's all right with Mr. Hayes. Yeah, of course. After they left, Nolan's son was buzzing with energy. Dad, Daniel has every game system ever made, and he said next time I can borrow some games to play here. And he goes to private school too, but a different one, and he said maybe we can convince our parents to let us go to the same school and… Whoa, slow down. His son took a breath. Can I be friends with him? Like, actual friends? The question hit harder than it should have. His kid was asking permission to have a friend, like friendship was a privilege that might be revoked. Like stability was so fragile that even normal childhood things required careful negotiation. Yeah, buddy, you can be friends with him. That night, after his son was asleep, Nolan sat in the new living room and tried to inventory everything that had happened in the past month. He had a real job with a real salary. His medical debt was being actively reduced by a lawyer who actually returned phone calls. His son was in a good school and had made a friend. They lived in an apartment that didn't smell like mold or exhaust fumes. On paper, he'd climbed out of the hole. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him was still temporary, that any moment the trapdoor would open and he'd fall right back into the chaos he'd barely escaped. His phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. Vivian wants to see you first thing Monday morning. Her office. Nolan stared at the message, waiting for the follow-up that would explain whether this was good or bad news. Nothing came. He texted back, "What's it about? She'll tell you tomorrow." Nolan barely slept Sunday night. His mind ran through scenarios, each worse than the last. Maybe she'd changed her mind about employing him. Maybe the reporter had published a follow-up article. Maybe someone had complained about him being around Daniel. By the time Monday morning arrived, he'd convinced himself he was about to be fired in the kindest way possible. He showed up at Vivian's office at 8 a.m. sharp. She was already at her desk, reading something on her tablet. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes." He sat. His injured hand was trembling badly enough that he had to tuck it under his leg to keep it still. Vivian set down the tablet. I've been reviewing your performance over the past 6 weeks. You've completed every assigned task competently, identified and resolved several issues before they became emergencies, and maintained professional boundaries despite having access to areas of this estate that most contractors never see. This sounded like the preamble to a firing. Nolan braced himself. I'm increasing your salary to $4,500 a month, effective immediately. Additionally, I'm enrolling you in the estate's health insurance plan, which will cover any follow-up care you need for your hand injury. Nolan's brain stuttered. What? $4,500 monthly plus health benefits. Is that unclear? No, Why? Because your current salary was based on a trial period. The trial period is over. This is your actual compensation. Vivian pulled up something on her computer. The insurance enrollment requires some paperwork. Patricia will handle that with you this afternoon. I don't understand. I haven't done anything special. You've done exactly what I hired you to do, without drama or complications. In my world, that's exceptional. She looked at him directly. You seem uncomfortable with the idea of being valued for your work. I'm uncomfortable with the idea that I might be getting more than I deserve. Let me be very clear about something, Mr. Hayes. I don't give people things they don't deserve. I don't operate on sentiment or sympathy. You are being compensated fairly for the value you provide to this estate. If that value decreases, so will your compensation. If it increases, we'll have this conversation again. She closed the laptop. Do you have any questions? Just one. Why are you helping me? Vivian was quiet for a moment. Because 6 years ago, I hired someone else who showed up desperate and skilled. Someone who needed an opportunity and proved they deserved it. That person is now my head of security and one of the few people I trust completely. Marcus has never forgotten what it felt like to be given a chance when he had nothing. I value that quality in my employees. Marcus was in my situation? Similar enough. Different details, same fundamentals. She stood, indicating the meeting was over. The insurance paperwork will include options for physical therapy for your hand. I suggest you take advantage of it. Nolan left the office in a daze. $4,500 a month. Health insurance. Physical therapy that might actually fix his hand instead of just managing the damage. He walked back to the apartment trying to do math in his head. How much he could save, how quickly he could pay down the remaining debt, what it would feel like to not wake up every morning calculating disaster scenarios. Patricia was waiting for him with a folder of insurance documents. They spent an hour going through options, selecting coverage, filling out forms. The whole process felt surreal, like playing at being a normal person who had normal benefits and normal problems instead of the constant edge of survival anxiety that had defined his life for months. You look shell-shocked, Patricia observed. I keep waiting for the catch, for someone to tell me this is a mistake. The catch is that you have to keep earning it. Vivian doesn't maintain charity cases. But if you keep doing what you've been doing, there's no reason this can't be permanent. Permanent. The word felt foreign. Nolan had stopped thinking in terms of permanent months ago, when everything he'd built had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Now he was being asked to believe that stability could last, that he could plan for a future instead of just surviving the present. That afternoon, he started physical therapy intake paperwork. The therapist's office was in Lake Forest, covered by the new insurance, and the first available appointment was Wednesday. Nolan marked it in his phone calendar and felt something close to optimism. Tuesday morning brought the first real test of his new situation. The estate's backup generator, not the ones he'd fixed on his first night, but a third unit that powered essential systems during outages, developed a fuel leak. Nolan caught it during a routine inspection, saw the slow drip of diesel pooling under the tank, and immediately shut down the system. He called Marcus. We've got a problem. The backup generator is leaking fuel. I've shut it down, but we need a permanent fix, and we need to clean up the spill before it becomes an environmental issue. Marcus was there in 5 minutes. They assessed the damage together, a corroded fuel line that had finally given way, probably decades old. The spill was containable, but required proper cleanup procedures. How fast can you fix it? Marcus asked. The line replacement is a few hours. The spill cleanup needs a hazmat service. We can't do that part ourselves. So call one. That's not my call to make. That's Vivian's budget. Marcus pulled out his phone and stepped away. Nolan heard fragments of the conversation, Marcus explaining the situation, Vivian asking questions, Marcus confirming details. When he came back, he was already pulling up a hazmat service on his phone. She approved it. Call them now. Get them out here today if possible. The hazmat team arrived within 3 hours. They cleaned up the spill, tested the soil, and issued a report confirming no lasting contamination. Nolan replaced the fuel line, tested the system, and had the generator operational again by evening. Vivian found him in the equipment building as he was finishing the documentation. Marcus tells me you caught this before it became a serious problem. That's literally my job. Many people would have waited until it was a serious problem before reporting it. Bigger emergency, more dramatic fix, better job security. She looked at the generator, now running smoothly. You could have milked this. I could have. But then you'd be dealing with contaminated soil and a 5-figure cleanup bill instead of a 3-hour repair. Exactly. She turned to leave, then stopped. My attorney called this morning. Your medical debt has been reduced to $5,800. The hospital accepted the fraud findings and waived the remaining disputed charges. You should receive confirmation this week. $5,800, down from $17,000. Nolan's throat went tight. Thank you. Thanks Susan Reeves. She did the work. I just paid her bill. Vivian walked toward the door, then paused again. Daniel's been asking if your son can come to dinner tomorrow night. Main house, 6 p.m., casual. Patricia will send details. She left before Nolan could process that his 6-year-old had been invited to dinner with a billionaire, and her son like it was a normal thing that happened to normal people. Wednesday brought physical therapy. The therapist was a woman in her 40s named Dr. Shaw, who spent 20 minutes just examining Nolan's hand, testing range of motion, asking about the injury and the surgery that had partially failed. The good news is there's no permanent nerve damage, she said finally. The tremor is muscular, caused by improper healing and compensatory movement patterns. We can work on that. Can you fix it? I can improve it significantly. Fix implies returning to pre-injury function, which may not be realistic, but we can get you to a point where the tremor is manageable and your grip strength is functional for most tasks. She put him through a series of exercises that hurt worse than any day of work he'd done in months. By the end of the session, his hand was screaming and sweat was dripping down his back. But Dr. Shaw seemed satisfied. Twice a week for the next 8 weeks. Home exercises daily. If you're compliant, we'll see real progress. Compliant. Like this was something he might choose not to do. Nolan scheduled the next appointment and drove back to the estate with his hand throbbing and his mind already planning how to fit the exercises into his work schedule. That evening, he and his son walked to the main house for dinner. His kid had changed clothes 3 times, nervous about eating with Daniel and Vivian in a formal setting. Nolan had tried to explain that it was just dinner, not a test, but he understood the anxiety. Everything felt like a test when your stability was this new. Patricia met them at the door and led them to a dining room that Nolan hadn't seen before. Smaller than he expected, more intimate. Vivian and Daniel were already there, and Daniel waved enthusiastically. You're here. Mom said we could have pizza. Do you like pizza? Nolan's son nodded, shy suddenly in the formal space. Dinner was strange in the best way. Vivian asked both boys about school, listened to their answers with actual attention, and didn't flinch when Daniel spilled soda across the table. She was still herself, precise, controlled, analytical, but there was a softness around the edges when she looked at her son that suggested the ruthless billionaire was only one part of who she was. Your dad fixed the backup generator this week, Vivian told Daniel. Caught a fuel leak before it became a problem. Cool. What's a fuel leak? Nolan explained it in terms a 10-year-old could understand. Daniel asked follow-up questions that were surprisingly technical. Vivian listened to the whole exchange with an expression that might have been pride. After dinner, the boys went to play video games in Daniel's room, and Nolan found himself alone with Vivian in the dining room while Patricia cleared dishes. Your son is well-mannered, Vivian said. That's not always the case with children who've experienced instability. I've tried to keep things as normal as possible, even when normal wasn't really an option. You've done well. He's resilient, but not hardened. That's a difficult balance. They sat in silence for a moment. Nolan wanted to ask her about Marcus, about the person she'd hired 6 years ago who'd been desperate and skilled. He wanted to know if that story had ended well, if there was a roadmap for how to navigate from barely surviving to actually stable. But before he could figure out how to ask, Patricia returned. Ms. Blackwood, your 8 o'clock call is in 5 minutes. Vivian stood. Nolan, Feel free to collect your son whenever you're ready, or leave him here. Lisa can walk him back to your apartment when they're done playing." She left, and Nolan sat alone in the dining room of a billionaire's mansion, trying to understand how his life had become this strange new thing where his kid had playdates with children who lived in houses with multiple dining rooms. He eventually collected his son around 8:30. The walk back to the apartment was quiet until his kid spoke up. "Dad, is this real?" "What do you mean?" "Like, all of this. The apartment, my school, being friends with Daniel. Is it real or is it going to disappear?" Nolan stopped walking. They were halfway between the main house and the garage, standing under a streetlight that illuminated the grounds. He knelt down so they were eye level. "I think it's real, but I also think we have to work to keep it real. Does that make sense?" His son nodded seriously. "Like how I have to work to keep my grades good so I can stay at my school?" "Exactly like that. I have to work hard at my job, you have to work hard at school, and we both have to remember that this is a good situation that we're lucky to have. I won't forget, I promise." They walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. That night, tucking his son into bed, in a room with actual space and actual bookshelves, Nolan felt the full weight of how far they'd come. 2 months ago, they'd been sleeping in a car, counting change to buy food, one cold night away from catastrophe. Now they had a home, insurance, a future that extended past next week. The danger was believing it was permanent, that nothing could take it away. But the greater danger was being so afraid of losing it that he couldn't enjoy having it at all. Nolan turned off the light and went to his own room. Tomorrow he had work to do. The greenhouse heating system still needed that pre-winter inspection, and there was a drainage issue near the north wall that needed attention before the ground froze. Normal problems. Solvable problems. He fell asleep planning repair schedules instead of calculating how many days until eviction. Progress, he thought. This was what progress felt like. Progress lasted exactly 11 days. Nolan was in the equipment shed on a Thursday afternoon, inventorying winter supplies, when his phone rang. Unknown number. He'd gotten better about not answering those, but something made him pick up this time. "Mr. Hayes? This is Jennifer from Lake Forest Academy. We have a situation with your son, and we need you to come to the school immediately." His heart stopped. "Is he hurt?" "He's not injured, but there's been an incident. How soon can you be here?" Nolan was in his truck before the call ended. The drive to the school took 12 minutes that felt like hours. His mind ran through possibilities, each worse than the last. Fight, accident, something he'd done or said that had revealed how precarious their situation really was. The receptionist directed him to the principal's office. Inside, his son sat in a chair looking smaller than Nolan had ever seen him, eyes red from crying. Next to him sat another boy, older, maybe 8, with his mother, a woman in expensive athleisure wear who looked furious. The principal, a thin man in his 50s named Dr. Morrison, gestured for Nolan to sit. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming so quickly. We have a serious issue to discuss." The other mother spoke before the principal could continue. "Your son attacked my son, pushed him down on the playground and threatened him." Nolan looked at his kid. "Is that true?" His son's voice came out barely above a whisper. "He said you were a charity case, that we didn't belong here." "That doesn't give you the right to put your hands on another student," the mother snapped. "Lucas has a bruised elbow from where he fell." Dr. Morrison held up a hand. "Let me explain what the playground supervisor witnessed. Lucas made comments about your family's financial situation. Your son told him to stop." Lucas continued, and the comments became more pointed. "Your son then pushed Lucas, who fell and sustained minor injuries." "He threatened to do it again," Lucas's mother added. "My son was terrified." Nolan looked at his son again. "Did you threaten him?" A small nod. "I said if he didn't shut up, I'd make him shut up." The room went silent. Nolan felt the eyes on him, felt the judgment, felt the fragile stability he'd built starting to crack. This was the moment where everything could fall apart, where the poor kid from the broken home proved he didn't belong in a school like this after all. "I'm very sorry," Nolan said carefully. "My son was wrong to push your son and wrong to make threats. That's not acceptable behavior, and it won't happen again." "You're sorry?" Lucas's mother's voice went sharp. "That's it? Your son assaulted my child and all you have to say is sorry? What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to explain why a child with obvious behavioral issues is enrolled in a school like this in the first place. My husband and I pay significant tuition for a safe environment, and your son, who I'm told is here on some kind of charity arrangement, is disrupting that environment. Something cold settled in Nolan's chest. My son is not a charity case. He's enrolled here because his employer provides education benefits. He made a mistake, he'll face consequences, but he's not some kind of threat to your precious safe environment. Mr. Hayes, Dr. Morrison interrupted, I don't think this is productive. You're right. Let me be productive. Nolan turned to Lucas's mother. Your son bullied mine, made fun of him for being poor, maybe spend less time worried about tuition and more time teaching your kid not to be cruel. Lucas's mother stood up. How dare you? I will be speaking to the board about this, about both of you. She grabbed her son and left. The door closed with enough force to qualify as a slam. Dr. Morrison sighed. Mr. Hayes, I understand you're upset, but antagonizing other parents doesn't help your son's situation. Neither does letting their kids bully him without consequences. Lucas will receive appropriate discipline for his comments, but your son's physical response is a separate issue. Dr. Morrison pulled out a form. School policy requires a 3-day suspension for physical altercation. He can return on Monday. Nolan felt his son start to cry again, quiet and devastating. He put a hand on the kid's shoulder. Okay, is there anything else? Just that I need you to understand how seriously we take these matters. Another incident like this, and we'll have to reconsider his enrollment. The drive back to the estate was silent except for his son's occasional sniffles. Nolan's mind was working through implications. 3 days home from school meant 3 days Nolan couldn't work full days. Meant questions about why his kid was suspended. Meant proving Lucas's mother right about kids like them not belonging in places like that school. Back at the apartment, Nolan sat his son down at the kitchen table. Tell me what happened. All of it. The story came out in fragments. Lucas had been making comments for weeks. Small stuff at first. Observations about Nolan's truck being old. Questions about why they lived on someone else's property. But today he'd said something that hit harder. That Nolan's son only had clothes and supplies because Vivian Blackwood felt sorry for them. That they were like pets someone kept around out of pity. And I got so mad, his son whispered. I told him he didn't know anything. He said everyone knew we were homeless before we came here. That his mom said we probably weren't even going to stay long because people like us never do. So you pushed him. I wanted him to stop talking, and he wouldn't stop. Nolan rubbed his face with his good hand. You can't hit people for saying things you don't like, even when those things are mean, even when they're true. They're not true. We're not charity. You work really hard. I do work hard. But we are here because Ms. Blackwood gave us an opportunity when we had nothing. That's not shameful, but it's also not something you can make disappear by pushing someone. His son started crying harder. I messed everything up. Now we're going to have to leave. We're not leaving. You're suspended for 3 days. You're going to write an apology to Lucas, whether he deserves it or not, and you're going to learn to walk away from fights you can't win. What if he doesn't stop? What if he keeps saying stuff? Then you tell a teacher. You tell me. You don't put your hands on him. Nolan pulled his son into a hug. I know it's hard. I know you want to defend us, but fighting only proves people like Lucas's mom right. You understand? A small nod against his chest. After his son went to his room, Nolan texted Marcus. My kid got suspended from school for 3 days. Thought you should know before someone else tells Vivian. The response came immediately. She already knows. Dr. Morrison called her 20 minutes ago. She wants to see you at 6. Nolan spent the intervening hours trying to figure out how to explain this without sounding like he was making excuses. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, he'd given up on explanations and decided to just accept whatever came next. Vivian's study felt different this time. Less like a business meeting, more like a tribunal. She sat behind her desk with an expression Nolan couldn't read. Dr. Morrison gave me his version of events, she said without preamble. I'd like to hear yours. Nolan laid it out factually. The bullying, the push, the suspension, the confrontation with Lucas's mother. He didn't editorialize or defend, just reported what had happened. When he finished, Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Did your son threaten this other child? Yes. And you believe the other child deserved it? I believe my son was provoked. But no, I don't think threats are justified. Nolan met her eyes. He was wrong. I've told him that. He'll apologize. Mrs. Carmichael, Lucas's mother, called me after leaving the school. She suggested that perhaps Lake Forest Academy wasn't the right fit for your family. She was quite insistent about it. Nolan's stomach dropped. And you agree with her? What I think is that Mrs. Carmichael is a bully raising a bully, and I have very little patience for either of them. Vivian pulled up something on her computer. However, she's not entirely wrong about the situation. Your son is struggling to adjust to an environment where wealth is assumed and poverty is remarkable. That's not his fault, but it is creating friction. So what are you saying? I'm saying we need to address this directly instead of pretending it's not happening. Daniel will talk to your son this weekend. They'll discuss how to navigate these situations without resorting to violence. Additionally, I'll be speaking to Dr. Morrison about implementing stronger anti-bullying policies that address socioeconomic harassment specifically. Nolan blinked. You're going to bat for my kid with the school? I'm going to make it clear that students on scholarship or employee benefit programs are entitled to the same respect as full tuition students. If Lucas and his mother have a problem with that, they can find another school. She closed her laptop. But your son needs to understand that my protection only extends so far. Another physical altercation and the decision will be out of my hands. I understand. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make sure he learns from this. She paused. And Nolan? The comments Mrs. Carmichael made about charity arrangements? Those reflect her insecurity, not your reality. You're employed here because you're skilled. Your son is enrolled in that school because it's part of your compensation package. Neither of those things is charity. After Nolan left, he sat in his truck for a while before driving back to the apartment. Vivian had just defended his son to a wealthy parent and promised to change school policy. That wasn't something employers did for simple maintenance workers. That was something people did when they actually cared. The question was why she cared, and whether that caring would survive the next inevitable crisis. Friday morning, Nolan brought his son to work with him. There was no way to leave a 6-year-old alone for 8 hours, and asking Patricia or Lisa to babysit felt like overstepping. So his kid sat in the equipment shed with a book, while Nolan worked on winterizing the irrigation system. Marcus found them around noon. Vivian wants to see both of you. Main house. In the study, Daniel was already there with Vivian. The two boys eyed each other uncertainly. Daniel has something to say, Vivian prompted. I heard what happened at your school, Daniel said to Nolan's son. That kid sounds like a jerk. But Mom says you can't hit people even when they're jerks, because then you get in trouble and they don't. Nolan's son nodded seriously. So I wanted to tell you what I do when kids say stuff about my mom. They say she's mean or weird or that she only cares about money, and I used to get really mad. Daniel glanced at Vivian. I got suspended once for throwing a chair at someone. Daniel, Vivian said quietly. What? I did, and you told me the same thing I'm telling him now, that people who are insecure say mean things to feel better about themselves, and the best way to beat them is to not care what they think. It's hard not to care, Nolan's son said. I know, but it's harder to keep getting in trouble, trust me. Daniel pulled out his phone. Want to play games in my room? Mom said we could if your dad says it's okay. Nolan nodded, and both boys left. Alone with Vivian, he struggled to find words. Daniel threw a chair at someone 2 years ago. A boy who made comments about me being a single mother. Daniel broke the boy's arm. Vivian's expression was carefully neutral. I spent 6 months fighting to keep him enrolled in that school. It was the worst professional situation I've ever navigated, and I've navigated hostile corporate takeovers. But you fought for him. Of course. He's my son. Just like you fought for yours today, even though it put you in an uncomfortable position with another parent. She stood and walked to the window. Children model what we show them. Daniel saw me refuse to back down when people attacked our family, so he learned not to back down. That's a valuable lesson, but it's also dangerous. What changed? How did you teach him to stop fighting? I didn't. His therapist did. Over months of work teaching him that there's a difference between defending yourself and destroying yourself in the process. Vivian turned back. Your son might benefit from similar support. I can provide a referral if you're interested. Therapy's covered by the insurance? Yes. And before you ask, no, it's not charity. It's preventive maintenance. Cheaper to address issues early than to deal with consequences later. Nolan left the meeting feeling like he'd glimpsed something rare. Vivian Blackwood as an actual parent instead of a ruthless billionaire. The image didn't quite fit with everything else he knew about her, but then again, most people didn't fit neat categories. The weekend passed quietly. His son wrote the apology letter to Lucas, practicing it 8 times before Nolan approved the final version. Daniel came over both days, and Nolan watched the two boys play video games while having surprisingly mature conversations about dealing with bullies and when adults were worth trusting. Monday morning, Nolan drove his son back to school. Dr. Morrison met them at the entrance. "I wanted to speak with you before classes start. Mrs. Carmichael filed a formal complaint about your son's behavior and your conduct during our meeting." Nolan's jaw tightened. And I reviewed all available evidence, including security footage and witness statements. Lucas initiated the confrontation with targeted harassment that violated our anti-bullying policy. Your son's response was disproportionate but understandable. Dr. Morrison handed Nolan a folder. Lucas received a 1-day suspension for harassment. Mrs. Carmichael has been informed that any future complaints will require substantiation, and that tuition status has no bearing on student rights or protections. Mom, Vivian talked to you. Ms. Blackwood made several compelling points about ensuring equitable treatment for all students. She also reminded me that her family has been significant donors to this institution and expects those donations to support inclusive excellence. Dr. Morrison smiled slightly. She can be very persuasive when she chooses to be. After dropping his son at class, Nolan drove back to the estate and found Marcus in the garage. "Vivian defended my kid to the school administration." "I know, I helped her draft the talking points." Marcus looked up from the car he was inspecting. "You seem surprised." "I'm trying to figure out why she'd stick her neck out like that, risk her relationship with a school where her own son is enrolled. Because Daniel asked her to, and because she doesn't like bullies, especially ones who use money as leverage." Marcus closed the car hood. "You're still thinking like someone who expects to be disposable. You're not. Not to her, not to Daniel, not to this household. The sooner you accept that, the easier this gets. And if I screw up? If my kid gets in another fight, or I miss something critical on a repair, then we'll deal with it. But stop borrowing trouble from the future. You've got enough actual problems without inventing new ones." That afternoon, Nolan had his second physical therapy session. Dr. Shaw put him through exercises that hurt even worse than the first session, but afterward, his hand felt different. Not better exactly, but more controlled. The tremor was still there, but smaller. "You're making progress," Dr. Shaw said. "The muscles are responding to treatment. Keep doing the home exercises and we'll see significant improvement by week 6. Significant improvement. Functional grip strength. The possibility of working without constant compensation for an injured hand." Nolan drove back to the estate, allowing himself to hope that maybe the damage wasn't permanent after all. November slid into December with a cold snap that pushed Nolan's work into overdrive. Frozen pipes, heating system malfunctions, ice damage to the greenhouse roof. He worked long hours, and his son spent afternoons with Daniel. The two boys bonded by shared experience of being different from their peers. 2 weeks before Christmas, Vivian called Nolan to her study again. "I'm hosting a small gathering here on the 23rd, 15 people, mostly business associates and their families. I'll need additional help with preparation and coordination. Are you interested in overtime work?" "Yes, whatever you need." Patricia will coordinate the details. It's a formal event, which means the estate needs to be pristine. I'm trusting you to handle any mechanical or structural issues that arise during preparation. The next week was controlled chaos. Caterers, decorators, musicians, all descending on the estate to prepare for Vivian's first social gathering in 3 years. Nolan fixed a malfunctioning fountain, repaired outdoor lighting, and spent 6 hours troubleshooting the sound system in the main hall. The night of the event, he stayed in the background, monitoring systems and ready to handle any emergency. He watched wealthy people in expensive clothes navigate the party with practiced ease, talking business and politics in schools their children attended. This was Vivian's world, polished, controlled, insulated from the kind of chaos that had defined Nolan's life a few months ago. Around 10 p.m., a man in his 60s approached Nolan near the equipment room. "You're the maintenance supervisor, correct?" "Yes, sir." Richard Chen. I own the estate next door. He extended his hand. Nolan shook it, aware of his own calluses against the man's soft palm. My grandson mentioned your son, said they're friends. It took Nolan a moment to connect the dots. Your grandson is Lucas? Unfortunately, yes. I wanted to apologize for my daughter-in-law's behavior. She can be overzealous about protecting Lucas, even when he doesn't deserve protection. It's fine, kids worked it out. Perhaps. But adults should model better behavior. I've spoken to Lucas about his comments. He knows they were inappropriate. Richard glanced around the party. Vivian tells me you're quite skilled, that you've solved problems here that stumped professionals. I just fix things. A rare talent, in my experience. Most people these days just replace things. Richard pulled out a business card. If you're ever interested in additional work, I have several properties that could use someone reliable. The pay would be competitive. Nolan took the card, uncertain how to respond. I appreciate that, but I'm pretty committed here. Of course. But keep the card anyway. One never knows when circumstances change. After Richard left, Nolan stood there holding the business card and feeling the weight of possibility. Other work. Other opportunities. The chance to build something beyond just surviving in Vivian's orbit, but also the risk. The danger of spreading too thin, of losing focus, of proving that he couldn't handle the one good situation he'd managed to find. He put the card in his pocket and went back to work. The party ended around midnight. Nolan helped coordinate cleanup, checked all systems one final time, and was walking back to his apartment when he found Vivian standing outside, looking at the Chicago skyline in the distance. Successful evening, he said. Successful enough? The contracts I needed to secure are moving forward. She glanced at him. Richard Chen spoke to you. He apologized for his daughter-in-law, offered me additional work if I'm interested. Are you interested? Nolan considered lying but couldn't see the point. Maybe, but not now. I've got enough to manage here. If that changes, let me know. I don't own you, Nolan. If better opportunities arise, I won't hold you back. This is a better opportunity. Better than anything I could have found on my own. Today. But 6 months from now? A year? Vivian turned back to the skyline. One of the mistakes I've seen people make is confusing gratitude with obligation. You're grateful for this job, and you should be. But don't let that gratitude trap you if something better comes along. Why are you telling me this? Because I value competence over loyalty, extracted through economic dependency. If you stay here, I want it to be because this is the best option for you and your son, not because you're afraid to look elsewhere. She went inside, leaving Nolan alone with the cold night and the distant lights of a city that had almost destroyed him. He thought about Richard Chen's offer, about physical therapy that was actually working, about his son thriving in a school where he was learning to navigate conflict without resorting to violence. Progress wasn't just about escaping poverty. It was about building enough stability that you could make choices instead of just accepting whatever came next. Nolan walked back to his apartment where his son was asleep in a room with heat and lights and the kind of safety that most kids took for granted. He checked on the kid, pulled the blanket up higher, and allowed himself to believe that maybe they'd actually made it. That maybe the worst was behind them and the future held something other than desperate calculation. Outside, winter settled deeper into Chicago. But inside the apartment above Vivian Blackwood's garage, Nolan Hayes and his son slept warm and safe and almost secure. The call came 3 weeks into January, just after dawn on a Tuesday morning when Chicago was locked in the kind of cold that made breathing hurt. Nolan was already awake, doing his physical therapy exercises in the kitchen, when his phone lit up with a number he recognized immediately. Susan Reeves, the attorney who'd been handling his medical debt. Mr. Hayes, I have good news. The remaining balance has been settled. Nolan's hand, mid-exercise, froze. Settled how? I haven't made any payments yet. Ms. Blackwood paid it, the full $5,800. As of this morning, you have zero medical debt in collections. The phone felt heavy in Nolan's hand. She paid my debt. She did. I have the documentation if you need it for your records, but essentially, you're clear. No more collectors, no more accruing interest, nothing. After the call ended, Nolan sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone. Zero debt. After months of that number hanging over him like a countdown to inevitable collapse, It was just gone. Vivian had erased it with what was probably the equivalent of pocket change to her, but represented everything to him. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the uncomfortable weight of obligation settling deeper into his chest. By the time he made it to Vivian's study at 8 a.m., he'd worked himself into something close to anger. She looked up from her computer, eyebrows raised. "You look upset. Is there a problem?" "You paid my medical debt." "Susan called you already. I asked her to wait until 9. Vivian closed her laptop. "Yes, I paid it. The interest was becoming counterproductive, and you were never going to get ahead of it on your current salary. You should have asked me first. Why? So you could tell me not to? So you could insist on paying it yourself over the next 5 years while interest ate away at every dollar?" She leaned back in her chair. "I made a business decision, Nolan. Debt-free employees are more productive and less distracted. There's no sentiment here." "That's bullshit, and you know it. This isn't about productivity. This is about—" He stopped, trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "About what? Say it." "About me owing you everything. About you having all the power in this relationship and me having none. About charity dressed up as business so we can both pretend it's something else." Vivian's expression went cold. "Is that what you think this is? Charity? What else would you call it? You let me stay when I had nothing, gave me a job I barely qualified for, paid for my son's school, got me health insurance, defended us to administrators and other parents, and now you've eliminated my debt. At what point does this stop being employment and start being rescue? When you stop seeing yourself as someone who needs rescuing." Her voice was sharp enough to cut. "I didn't give you this job out of pity. I gave it to you because you demonstrated value on your first night here by fixing generators that stumped professionals. Everything since then has been a return on that investment. Your skills have saved me tens of thousands in contractor fees. Your reliability has eliminated problems before they became emergencies. You've earned every single thing you've received." "Except the debt payment. I didn't earn that." "No, you didn't. I gave it to you anyway because watching you struggle under that burden was inefficient and annoying." Vivian stood and walked to the window. "You want to know the real reason I paid it? Because 6 years ago, someone did the same thing for Marcus. He had gambling debt that was going to destroy him, and I eliminated it. Not because I'm generous, but because talented people being crushed by solvable problems is wasteful. Marcus has repaid that investment 100 times over through loyalty and competence. I expect the same from you." Nolan felt the fight drain out of him. "I don't know how to not feel like I owe you everything." "Then owe me. But repay it through work, not guilt. Guilt is useless to me." She turned back. "And Nolan, if the debt is what's bothering you, you should know that I also have a proposal that might change your employment situation entirely." "What kind of proposal?" Vivian returned to her desk and pulled up a document. "I'm creating a new position, Estate Operations Manager. It would include oversight of all maintenance, coordination with external contractors, budget management for repairs and upgrades, and supervision of any additional staff we hire for grounds and facilities work. The salary would be $75,000 annually, plus continued benefits and housing." Nolan's brain stuttered over the number. $75,000. The position requires someone who understands the estate systems intimately and can make decisions without constant supervision. You're the only person I trust to do that job. She slid a folder across the desk. "This is the full job description. Read it, think about it, and give me an answer by Friday." "Why are you doing this now?" "Because my business is expanding and I need someone managing this property who isn't me. Because you've proven yourself capable over the past 4 months. And because, frankly, I'm tired of micromanaging maintenance schedules when I should be focused on acquisitions." She paused. "Also, Daniel asked me to make sure you and your son aren't going anywhere. Apparently he's convinced that if I don't pay you enough, you'll leave and he'll lose his only real friend." Something in Nolan's chest cracked open. "Your son asked you to give me a raise?" "He asked me to make sure you stay. The raise is how I'm choosing to accomplish that." Vivian's expression softened slightly. "My son has struggled to connect with other children. Most of them want to be his friend because of who I am, what I have. Your son doesn't care about any of that. He just likes Daniel. That's rare. That's valuable. So yes, I'm willing to invest in keeping your family here." Nolan picked up the folder, hands trembling. "I need to think about this. I know. That's why you have until Friday. He left the study in a daze and spent the next 2 days reading and rereading the job description. Estate operations manager? Real salary, real responsibility. The kind of position that came with business cards and authority to make decisions that affected budgets in the hundreds of thousands. He called the one person he thought might understand. Marcus, can we talk? They met in the garage that evening. Marcus listened while Nolan explained the offer, the debt payment, the conversation with Vivian about charity versus investment. You're overthinking this, Marcus said when Nolan finished. She's offering you a real job with real compensation because you've demonstrated real value. Take it or don't, but stop torturing yourself about whether you deserve it. Did you feel this way when she paid your debt? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I felt like I'd sold my soul, like I could never leave, never disagree, never be anything but grateful for the rest of my life. It took me 2 years to realize that's not what she wanted. She wanted someone competent who didn't need their hand held. Once I understood that, everything got easier. How did you get there? To understanding it? By screwing up, by making a bad call on a security issue that cost her money and credibility. I thought she'd fire me immediately. Instead, she sat me down and asked me what I'd learned and how I'd handle it differently next time. That's when I realized she wasn't looking for perfection. She was looking for someone who could grow and improve and take ownership of mistakes. Nolan absorbed this. What if I take this job and fail? What if I'm not ready for this kind of responsibility? Then you'll fail and figure out what comes next, but you won't know until you try. And Nolan? She doesn't offer positions like this to people she thinks will fail. She's too practical for that. On Thursday night, Nolan sat his son down for a serious conversation. Ms. Blackwood offered me a promotion. More money, more responsibility. If I take it, it means we'll definitely be staying here for a long time. His son's eyes went wide. We get to stay? Like, really stay? If I take the job, yeah, this would be our home. You'd finish school here. I'd keep working here. No more moving. Then you should take it, obviously. It's not that simple. More responsibility means more pressure. It means I have to be really good at this job or we could still lose everything. His son was quiet for a moment, then said something that hit Nolan harder than expected. Dad, you're always scared we're going to lose everything. But we haven't. We keep being okay. Maybe it's time to believe we actually are okay. Out of the mouths of 6-year-olds came wisdom that adults spent years trying to learn. Nolan pulled his son into a hug and decided that maybe belief was its own kind of skill, one he needed to practice as deliberately as physical therapy exercises. Friday morning, he knocked on Vivian's study door at precisely 8 a.m. I accept the position, estate operations manager. I'll do everything I can to prove you made the right choice. Vivian's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested satisfaction. Good. You start Monday. Patricia will handle the paperwork. And Nolan? Stop trying to prove yourself. Just do the work. The transition to the new role was smoother than Nolan expected. Vivian had been serious about not wanting to micromanage. She handed him the estate's maintenance budget, a database of preferred contractors, and a set of priorities that boiled down to keep everything functional without wasting money. The autonomy was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. His first major decision came 2 weeks into the new position. The estate's HVAC system was 15 years old and starting to show its age. He could keep repairing it, stretching out its life for another few years, or he could recommend a complete replacement that would cost $60,000 but eliminate constant small failures. He ran the numbers 3 times, built a presentation comparing long-term costs, and scheduled a meeting with Vivian. Replace it, she said, after reviewing his analysis for exactly 90 seconds. Your math is sound and your logic is correct. Order the new system. You're not going to question my recommendation? Why would I? I hired you to make these decisions. If I wanted to make them myself, I wouldn't need an operations manager. She closed the presentation. This is your job now, Nolan. Make decisions, own the outcomes, learn from mistakes. I'll support you unless you give me a reason not to. The HVAC replacement took 3 weeks and came in slightly under budget. Nolan coordinated contractors, managed the installation timeline, and solved problems as they arose without bothering Vivian unless absolutely necessary. When it was finished, the estate had a modern, efficient system that would last decades. Marcus found him in the equipment room after the final inspection. Vivian's impressed. She doesn't say it, but I can tell. How can you tell? Because she just approved the budget for upgrading the security system that I've been asking about for 6 months. She's in a good mood, which means she's satisfied with how things are running. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. You're doing well. Stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Nolan couldn't quite shake the feeling that stability this complete had to be temporary. The universe didn't just let people climb out of holes this deep without exacting some kind of price. The price came in March, but not in the form he expected. Patricia found him working on the greenhouse irrigation system on a Wednesday afternoon. Nolan, there's a woman at the front gate asking for you. She says she's your ex-wife. Everything inside Nolan went cold. Tell her I'm not here. I already told her you were on the property. She's been out there for 20 minutes. Security says she's not leaving until she talks to you. Nolan put down his tools and walked to the gate, feeling like he was heading to an execution. Through the bars, he could see her, older than he remembered, thinner, with the same eyes that had looked at him 3 years ago and decided he wasn't worth staying for. Rachel. Nolan, you look good. Better than when I left. What do you want? She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. I heard you were working here, living here. I wanted to see if it was true. It's true. Now you've seen it. You can leave. I also heard our son is with you, that you got him into a private school. He's my son, not ours. You gave up that right when you left. Rachel flinched. I made a mistake. I was scared and overwhelmed and I handled it badly. But I've been thinking about him, about both of you. I'm in a better place now and I thought maybe what? Maybe you could come back now that I'm not homeless and broken. Maybe you could be a mother again. Now that there's stability, you didn't have to build yourself? That's not fair. You're right. Fair would be you never showing up at all. Nolan's hands were shaking, but not from the injury this time. From rage he'd been suppressing for months. You left us with nothing. You took the money, the car, everything you could grab, and you walked away from your 6-year-old son. You don't get to show up now and pretend you're interested in being a parent. I want to see him. I have rights. You have nothing. You signed away custody. You haven't paid $1 in support. You have no legal claim to him whatsoever. Rachel's expression hardened. I can change that. I can get a lawyer, file for visitation rights. Courts favor mothers, Nolan. You know that. Then get a lawyer. File your paperwork. Spend your money on legal fees. Nolan stepped closer to the gate. But know that if you try to disrupt his life, the stable, safe life he has now, I will fight you with everything I have. And I'm not alone anymore. I have resources now. I have support. You want a custody battle? Bring it on. He walked away before she could respond, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Behind him, he heard her calling his name, but he didn't turn around. Back at the apartment, he found his son doing homework at the kitchen table. The kid looked up, smiled, and went back to his math problems like it was just another normal afternoon. Nolan stood in the doorway watching him, thinking about all the ways Rachel could destroy this if she really tried. The legal battles, the emotional damage, the uncertainty that would crack open the stability they'd built. He texted Marcus. My ex-wife showed up at the gate. She's talking about filing for visitation rights. I need to know what kind of legal support is available through my employment. The response came within minutes. Vivian's personal attorney can handle family law. I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow. Don't worry, we've got this. The meeting happened in Vivian's study the next morning. Her attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s named Jennifer Torres, listened to Nolan's explanation of the situation without interrupting. She abandoned custody and hasn't made support payments? Jennifer confirmed. Correct. The divorce decree gives me sole custody. She hasn't contacted us in almost 3 years. Then she has almost no legal standing. She can file motions, but courts don't look favorably on parents who disappear and then try to re-enter their children's lives when it's convenient. Jennifer made notes on her tablet. If she does file, we'll fight it. But honestly, most of these situations resolve when the absent parent realizes how much a custody battle actually costs. They usually disappear again. And if she doesn't disappear, then we document everything. Build a case showing your son's stability and well-being under your sole custody and demonstrate that her presence would be disruptive rather than beneficial. We'd win. It would just take time and money. After Jennifer left, Vivian stayed in her chair, watching Nolan with that analytical expression he'd learned meant she was processing something. This is the part where you tell me you understand if this becomes too much of a problem and I need to leave, Nolan said. Actually, I was thinking the opposite. That if your ex-wife is going to make your life difficult, you should have the strongest possible position to defend from. Vivian pulled up a document. I'm prepared to testify on your behalf if this goes to court. Character witness, confirmation of stable employment and housing, whatever's needed. Nolan's voice came out rough. You do that? I'd be doing it for your son. He's thriving here. He and Daniel have a friendship that's good for both of them. Disrupting that would be harmful to my child as well as yours. So yes, I'll do whatever's necessary to prevent that disruption. Rachel never filed any paperwork. 2 weeks after showing up at the gate, she called Nolan's phone and left a voicemail saying she'd reconsidered and thought it was better for everyone if things stayed as they were. Nolan deleted the message and never mentioned it to his son. Some threats were better left unspoken when they dissolved on their own. Spring arrived with the kind of warmth that made Chicago residents forget they'd ever complained about winter. The estate bloomed under Chen's careful cultivation, and Nolan's days filled with the rhythm of maintenance work that had become familiar instead of frightening. He was good at this job, better than good. He'd found something he didn't know he'd been looking for, not just employment, but purpose that came from building instead of just surviving. His physical therapy reached its conclusion in April. Dr. Shaw put him through a final assessment and declared him as recovered as he was going to get. The tremors reduced by about 70%, she explained. You'll probably always have some residual shake under stress or fatigue, but your grip strength is back to near normal and your fine motor control has improved significantly. You're cleared for full duty. Nolan looked at his hand, scarred, still slightly imperfect, but functional in ways it hadn't been in over a year. Thank you. Thank yourself. You did the work. She handed him a final report. And thank whoever got you this insurance. Physical therapy like this isn't cheap. On a Saturday in early May, Vivian called Nolan to the main house for what she said was an important conversation. He found her in the library with Marcus and Patricia, which immediately triggered his anxiety that this was either very good or very bad news. Sit down, Vivian said. I have a situation that requires your input. Nolan sat. 3 months ago, a man showed up at my gate asking for shelter. He had his 2 daughters with him, both under 10, and he'd lost his job due to a workplace injury. His story was remarkably similar to yours. Vivian paused. Marcus ran a complete background check. The man is exactly what he appears to be, desperate but honest, skilled but injured, trying to keep his children safe. Nolan's heart rate picked up. What did you do? I turned him away. I told him I couldn't help and gave him information for local shelters. Vivian's expression was unreadable. 2 weeks ago, he showed up again. Different circumstances, but the same underlying desperation. This time I asked Marcus and Patricia what they thought I should do. Marcus spoke up. We think you should help him, the way you helped Nolan. And I'm inclined to agree, Vivian continued, but I wanted your perspective first. You've been on both sides of this situation now, the person asking for help and the person in a position to provide it. What would you do? Nolan thought about that night 8 months ago, standing at the gate with his son freezing against his chest, desperate enough to beg a stranger for mercy. He thought about everything that had happened since, the generators, the apartment, the job, the stability that had rebuilt his life from nothing. I'd help him, Nolan said, but not the way you helped me. Vivian's eyebrow raised. Explain. You gave me a job I had to earn, which was right. But you also gave me things I didn't ask for. Debt payment, housing upgrades, legal support. That created obligation I'm still trying to balance. If it were me, I'd give him the same chance you gave me on that first night. Prove yourself or leave. But I'd make the terms clearer. Set expectations up front. Make sure he understands it's a transaction, not rescue. And if he can't meet those expectations, then you help him find somewhere he can. You don't owe anyone permanent support just because they show up desperate. But you can give them a chance to prove they're worth supporting. Vivian nodded slowly. Marcus, bring him to the estate tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. We'll see if he can fix the pool filtration system that's been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. She looked at Nolan. I want you to observe. Evaluate whether he has the skills and mindset to succeed here. Your recommendation will carry weight in my decision. The man who showed up the next morning looked like Nolan's reflection from 8 months ago. Exhausted, desperate. trying to hold himself together through sheer will while his daughters stayed close to his side. His name was David Martinez, and he had the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools for a living. Nolan showed him the pool filtration system and gave him the same challenge Vivian had given Nolan that first night: figure out the problem by evening or leave in the morning. David took 6 hours. He found a clogged impeller and a damaged pressure sensor, fixed both without asking for help, and had the system running perfectly by 4 p.m. When Nolan checked his work, it was thorough and professional. "You're good at this," Nolan said. "I used to maintain commercial pools before the injury. Haven't worked in 8 months." David's voice was rough with exhaustion. "Is this enough? Did I pass whatever test this was? That's not up to me. But if it were, I'd say yes." That evening, Vivian met with David in her study while Nolan waited outside with the man's daughters. They were quiet kids, watchful in the way children became when they learned that safety was conditional. Nolan gave them juice boxes from the kitchen and tried to remember how to talk to scared kids who reminded him too much of his own son. When David emerged from the study, his eyes were red but his shoulders were straighter. "She's giving us a chance," he said quietly. "1 week in a guest house. If I can prove myself, she'll consider longer-term employment." "Then prove yourself," Nolan said. "And if you need help figuring out how, ask. I've been where you are. I know how hard this is." Over the next month, Nolan watched David navigate the same challenges he'd faced: learning the estate systems, earning Marcus's trust, figuring out how to accept help without feeling diminished by it. He watched Vivian apply the same practical assessment she'd used with him, testing David's skills and character through increasingly complex repairs. And he realized something that had been building slowly over months. Vivian Blackwood's ruthlessness wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. She saw people as they actually were instead of how they wanted to be seen. She invested in capability, not potential. She created opportunities for those who could seize them and didn't waste time on those who couldn't. That approach had saved Nolan's life. Now it might save David's. By June, David had moved into the same guest house where Nolan had started, working the same probationary period with the same stakes. His daughters were enrolled in local schools, and he was rebuilding his life one repair at a time, the way Nolan had. "Thank you," David said one afternoon while they worked together replacing outdoor lighting, "for telling her to give me a chance. I didn't tell her anything, I just said what I thought." Nolan tightened a connection. "You're doing the work. That's what matters." "Still, you could have protected your position, kept the new guy out so you wouldn't have competition. That's not how this works. There's enough work here for multiple people, and Vivian values competence over territory wars. Besides..." Nolan paused, realizing the truth even as he said it. "Besides, I remember what it's like to be where you are. If I can help you get where I am, that's worth something." That night, Nolan's son asked a question that had apparently been brewing for a while. "Dad, are we rich now?" Nolan looked up from the dinner he was cooking. "Why are you asking?" "Because some kids at school said we must be rich if we live on Ms. Blackwood's estate, and you make enough money for me to go to private school." "We're not rich. We're stable. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" Nolan thought about how to explain this. "Rich means you have so much money that you don't worry about losing it. Stable means you have enough to live on and some saved up in case something goes wrong, but you still have to work to keep it. We're stable, and that's actually better than rich in some ways." "How?" "Because we earned it. We know what it took to get here, and we know what it takes to keep it. Rich people sometimes forget that. They take things for granted because they've always had them." Nolan served dinner. "You remember when we lived in the car?" His son nodded, expression serious. "That was less than a year ago. Everything we have now we built in less than a year. That's not rich. That's just hard work, and some luck, and people willing to give us chances when we needed them, like Ms. Blackwood." "Exactly, like Ms. Blackwood." They ate in comfortable silence, and Nolan thought about how different this conversation was from ones he'd imagined having during those desperate months. He'd thought the lessons he'd need to teach his son would be about survival, about making do with nothing, about how to stay hopeful when hope was irrational. Instead, he was teaching him about stability, about gratitude that didn't become obligation, about the difference between charity and investment, between rescue and opportunity. Better lessons. Harder to learn, maybe, but worth more in the long run. In August, Vivian promoted David to full-time maintenance assistant with a salary that would let him rent his own apartment off the estate. Nolan helped him apartment hunt, co-signed his lease when landlords balked at his employment history, and watched him move his daughters into a two-bedroom place that represented the same kind of impossible made real that Nolan had experienced. "You didn't have to do all this," David said as they carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs.
"Yeah, I did. Someone helped me when I needed it. Now I'm helping you. That's how this is supposed to work."
"Paying it forward?" "Something like that. Although honestly, it's more selfish than that sounds. Helping you helps me remember that this isn't just luck, that I actually earned my way here and can help others do the same." That realization, that helping others validated his own journey, felt like the final piece of something Nolan had been building without realizing it. Not just a new life, but a new understanding of what life could be. Not survival or success, but something in between. Stability built through work, maintained through discipline, and shared with others who needed the same chances he'd received. September brought his son's 7th birthday. Daniel insisted on a joint party at the estate, and Vivian agreed with the kind of casual indulgence that suggested she'd started enjoying having reasons to celebrate. The party was small, just both boys, a few school friends, Patricia, Chen, Marcus, Lisa, and David's daughters, but it felt complete in a way Nolan's son's previous birthdays never had. Watching his kid blow out candles on a cake that wasn't from a gas station, surrounded by actual friends in a place they actually lived, Nolan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, which always felt temporary and fragile, but contentment. The deep satisfaction of knowing that right now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Later that evening, after the guests had left and his son was asleep with the kind of exhausted satisfaction that came from a good day, Nolan found Vivian in her study. "Thank you for letting us use the house for the party." "It's a house. It's meant to be used." She looked up from her work. "Your son seems happy." "He is. Happier than I've seen him in years." Nolan hesitated. "I wanted to tell you something about that night I showed up at your gate." "I remember that night quite clearly. I was planning to ask you for one night, just shelter until morning, then we'd figure out something else. I didn't expect a job. I didn't expect any of this. I just wanted him to be warm for one night. And now? Now I understand that the best thing you gave me wasn't the job or the money or any of the practical help. It was the chance to prove I wasn't finished, that I could still be someone my son could be proud of instead of just someone he felt sorry for." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "I didn't give you that chance, Nolan. You already had it. You just needed someone to stop blocking the door." "Then thank you for not blocking the door." She smiled slightly. "You're welcome. Now go celebrate your son's birthday properly. And Nolan, stop thanking me for things you earned yourself. It's getting tiresome." Fall brought changes that felt like natural progression instead of crisis. The estate hired a third maintenance worker, a young woman fresh out of trade school who reminded Nolan of himself before the injury. Hungry, skilled, desperate to prove herself. He trained her the way he wished someone had trained him, teaching her not just the mechanical skills, but the softer knowledge about how to navigate working for someone like Vivian. His son continued to thrive at school, his friendship with Daniel deepening into something that looked like brotherhood. They did homework together, played video games, argued about pointless things with the comfortable ease of kids who trusted each other completely. Nolan's hand, while never perfect, became functional enough that he rarely thought about it anymore. The tremor appeared under stress or cold, but it was manageable, a reminder of where he'd been, not a limitation on where he could go. In November, exactly 1 year after he'd first stood at Vivian's gate, she called him to her study for a conversation he didn't expect. "I'm restructuring some of my business operations," she said without preamble. "Part of that includes formalizing the estate management into a proper business entity. I'm creating Blackwood Property Services, a company that will manage this estate and potentially take on contracts for other high-end properties. I want you to be the operations director." Nolan's brain took a moment to catch up. "A company? Like an actual business?" "Like an actual business. With a proper corporate structure, business insurance, professional certifications, the works. You'd oversee all technical operations, manage the growing staff, handle contractor relationships and client accounts if we expand to other properties." She slid a document across the desk. "Starting salary would be $95,000, plus benefits and profit sharing if we take on outside contracts. $95,000. Nolan stared at the number, trying to connect it to reality. A year ago, he'd been counting change for gas money. Now he was being offered a salary that would put him solidly into middle-class stability. Why me? You could hire someone with actual management experience, business credentials. I could, but they wouldn't have what you have. Intimate knowledge of this estate, proven reliability, and the kind of loyalty that comes from understanding what it means to build something from nothing. Vivian leaned forward. I don't need credentials, Nolan. I need someone who treats this work like it matters, because they remember what it's like when nothing matters except survival. You have that. Credentials I can buy. That quality I can't. I don't know anything about running a business. You'll learn, same way you learned everything else, by doing the work and fixing mistakes as you go. She pulled up something on her computer. I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm asking you to be willing to figure them out. Nolan took the document home and spent 3 days reading it, researching what operations directors actually did, trying to imagine himself in a role that came with business cards and the authority to hire and fire other employees. It felt impossible. It felt like someone else's life. But then again, so had everything else about the past year. He accepted the position on a Friday morning. Vivian handled the news with her typical lack of ceremony, immediately handing him a stack of paperwork and a timeline for when the new business entity needed to be operational. You start officially on January 1st, she said. That gives you 2 months to prepare. Use them. December passed in a blur of preparation. Nolan took online courses in business management, worked with Vivian's corporate attorneys to understand the legal structure they were building, and started identifying which properties might be good prospects for outside contracts. The learning curve was steep, but he'd climbed steeper curves before. On Christmas Eve, Vivian hosted another gathering at the estate. Smaller than the previous year, just household staff and close business associates. Nolan found himself in conversations with people who treated him like an equal, who asked his opinion on property management and listened to his answers like they mattered. David pulled him aside at one point, handing him a beer with a grin. You know what's wild? Last Christmas, I was sleeping in my car with my girls, trying to figure out how to explain to them why Santa probably wasn't coming. This Christmas, they're upstairs playing video games with your son and Daniel, and I'm standing in a mansion drinking expensive beer at a party where I actually belong. That's because of you. That's because of you doing the work. You know what I mean? You convinced Vivian to give me a chance. You helped me figure out how to take that chance and turn it into something real. So do the same thing for someone else when you get the opportunity. That's how this works. Later that night, after the party wound down and his son was asleep, Nolan stood outside the apartment looking at the estate grounds. A year ago, he'd stood at the gate with nothing but desperation and the faint hope that someone might show mercy. Now he stood here as the operations director of a business that didn't exist yet, living in an apartment that felt like home, watching his son grow up stable and safe. The transformation should have felt miraculous. Instead, it felt earned. Built through work that had started with fixing generators and expanded into fixing his entire life. Not a rescue. Not charity. An investment that had paid returns for everyone involved. His phone buzzed. Text from Vivian. Stop standing outside contemplating your life and come back inside. Marcus wants to propose a toast and he's refusing to do it unless everyone's present. Nolan smiled and walked back into the main house, where people he'd learned to call friends were waiting. Inside, Marcus raised a glass and spoke about the year that had passed, about the people who'd joined their strange extended family, about the work they'd all done to make the estate function smoothly. And to Nolan, Marcus finished, who showed up desperate and turned himself into someone essential. That takes guts. That deserves recognition. Everyone drank. Nolan felt his face heat with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. Vivian caught his eye across the room and raised her glass slightly, a private acknowledgement that this, all of this, was what investment looked like when it worked. When desperation met opportunity and both sides held up their end of an unspoken bargain. On New Year's Eve, Nolan's son asked if they could watch the fireworks from the roof of the main house, something Daniel had apparently told him was the best view in Chicago. Vivian gave permission, and they all went up, both boys, Vivian, Nolan, Marcus, Patricia, even Chen and David with his daughters. A strange collection of people who'd been thrown together by circumstance and choice and had somehow formed something that looked like family. As midnight approached and the city prepared to celebrate the turn of another year, Nolan's son leaned against him and asked a question that felt like it deserved a real answer. "Dad, do you think we're going to be okay? Like, forever?" Nolan thought about all the ways he could answer that, about probability and statistics, about how nothing was guaranteed and stability was always fragile, about how the universe didn't offer forever, just a series of todays that you had to earn over and over. But what he said was simpler and more true. "I think we're going to be okay as long as we keep working to be okay. As long as we remember that what we have now, we built, and what we build, we can maintain." That's not a yes. No, it's better than a yes. It's the truth. The fireworks started, lighting up the Chicago skyline with colors that seemed brighter from up here, looking down at a city that had almost destroyed them and now surrounded them with possibility instead of threat. Nolan watched his son's face illuminated by the explosions of light, saw wonder instead of fear, and thought about how far they'd traveled in a single year, from desperation to stability, from begging for shelter to managing an estate, from nothing to enough, which turned out to be more than Nolan had ever really needed. Not a miracle, not a rescue, just work and opportunity and the stubborn refusal to stay broken when someone offered the tools to fix yourself. The fireworks ended. The crowd on the roof started to disperse, heading back down to warmth and celebration. But Nolan stayed a moment longer, looking out at the city that had been so cruel and was now, somehow, home. Behind him, Vivian's voice. "You did well this year, Nolan. Better than I expected. High praise from you. Take the compliment. They're rare." She moved to stand beside him. "You know what I've learned from watching you this year? That the difference between someone who stays desperate and someone who builds themselves back up isn't talent or intelligence or even luck. It's the willingness to believe that today's stability is worth protecting even when you don't trust it to last." Is that what I did? That's exactly what you did. You stopped waiting for everything to collapse and started working like it might actually hold. That shift from survival mode to building mode, that's what made the difference. Nolan absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. Someone else will show up at your gate eventually, someone desperate like I was. Probably. You going to help them? That depends on whether they show me what you showed me, the capacity to turn desperation into discipline. If they can do that, yes. If they can't, no. I'm practical, remember? Not sentimental. And if they can, but they need someone to help them figure out how. Nolan looked at her. "I want to be the person who helps them. The way you helped me. The way I helped David." Vivian smiled. "Then you've learned the real lesson. That the point of climbing out isn't just to save yourself. It's to be able to reach back down and help the next person climb too." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last of the crowd filtered back inside. Two people who'd entered each other's lives through desperation and circumstance and had built something neither of them had planned, but both had needed. The wind picked up, carrying the cold promise of another Chicago winter. But Nolan didn't feel the cold the way he used to. He felt it as information, as something to prepare for rather than something to survive. Inside, his son was laughing with Daniel about something. Inside, people who'd become family were celebrating the kind of ordinary joy that came from stability instead of survival. Inside was warmth and safety, and the future Nolan had rebuilt from nothing. He turned and walked back inside, leaving the cold in the past and the desperate man he'd been standing at that gate 12 months ago, somewhere out in the dark where they belonged. What mattered was here, now. The work he'd do tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The life he'd continue to build, one repair at a time, until he couldn't remember any more what it felt like to have nothing. The door closed behind him. The new year had started. And Nolan Hayes, once broken and desperate, now operations director of Blackwood Property Services, was finally, completely, earning his place in the world. Not because someone had given it to him, but because he'd proven, day after day, that he deserved it.